Greetings once more, dear friends. Fanatical Dragon here once again, and joined by a wonderful, incredible special guest today, by the magnificent Brandon Bentley.
Hello.
I don't know entirely how best to describe your resume because it's huge. I was a writer, producer, director,
Good
photographer.
question. What did I call myself on Twitter? Jack of all trades, master of none. Because that's how it feels sometimes. I kind of have just, thrown everything at the proverbial wall to see what sticks in regards to film, video, and things like that. I've been into film for, decades, but we'll get into that momentarily.
Yeah, because did you start? I certainly know, because my own background, I went to film school and stuff, and there was a time when photography and film, or later video, were very separate worlds.
Yeah.
And then there's this weird fusion, kind of the rise of sort of DSLRs brought those two worlds colliding really quite spectacularly. And at that point, I found it was an awful lot easier to kind of get work in both fields because you were kind of using the same gear. Is that slightly similar to what happened with yourself? Or?
Kind of. What's funny is I went to college for film specifically. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, when I was in college, we had to take a photography class for our film degree. Mm-hmm. And I joked with people, it's like, well, it's motion picture without the motion. So, it makes sense. Mm-hmm. And you realize, oh, wait, this is actually helping to teach you how to frame your shots, why you want to use this lens instead of that lens. And so over time, I just really got into photography with that. So, and this was right before DSLRs really exploded. This was early 2006. Mm-hmm. So I was actually shooting on actual film. Same. And then by that summer, I was getting into, I don't even know if it was technically a DSLR or just, digital camera, because it was I think 10 megapixel photos, and which, for 2006 wasn't bad. But over time, like you said, those worlds have just melded even more so. And, I did a 48-hour film project recently where I was, shooting the film on the same camera that I was getting the photos needed for the poster. So whatever works.
Yeah, no, that's cool. And I think it's made it infinitely more accessible to an awful lot of people. Oh, yeah. It's flooded the market a lot, because there was certainly a huge amount of gatekeeping back certainly when I was studying. The film industry was particularly quite kind of cliquey and snobby about allowing access and things. And I think the lowering of the cost of technology has given rise to, I think, this incredible period that we're in just now. So there's so much opportunities. And I spoke to Adam from Third Window quite recently about a great little Japanese film called Beyond the Infinite 2 Minutes. And that was all shot on literally kind of pocket-sized 4K cameras using an iPhone as a monitor. And
gotcha.
Crazy. And that kind of the likes of that. But when I was going through studying... Yeah, basically, I think so. And I think that's so far removed from we were taught on Super 16 and stuff when I was at film school, which was the most stress I've ever experienced in my life, is the sound of a Super 16 camera just churning money because they're really noisy.
And then blindly trying to load the film inside of a bag. It's well, it might be right. We'll find out in 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, and see if I've blown $2,000 on absolutely nothing. It was so expensive.
And I don't miss that part. I like film, but I feel like I was not the right person to physically try to get it in there. It's I think I'll let you do the thing, then I'll just direct you later. It's fine.
Yeah. I'm not just my anxiety. I learned very quickly my anxiety levels could not handle a celluloid life. Really, I think digital is so much more comfortable. I love being able to see what I'm doing. Anyway, we digress. So, how did you kind of move from that into doing stuff behind the scenes? I think the very first time I became aware of your work on DVDs and on Blu-rays, and I think was on the Criterion collection. So I don't know if that was your first foray into Commentaries.
Well, the funny thing about that, not everyone knows the story behind this. I feel like I need to go back a little further. Mm-hmm. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because I feel like the Criterion set is when people did start to kind of notice my work and notice the Big Boss commentary, because a lot of people don't realize, if you look at the data on there, because one thing I like that Criterion does, I think Era does the same thing, is if there's an archival commentary, they will say, oh, this commentary with this person from this year. So if you look at the Criterion set, you'll see, oh, commentary by Brandon Bentley from 2016, because a lot of people didn't realize that commentary I had recorded for the second Shout Factory release of the film.
Ah, okay.
But what happened was I got to go back even further to the 2013 box set that Shout did. That was actually my first time working with a Blu-ray company. So it's been 10 years. Granted, there was a lot of patches in between.
Happy because I did
I did nothing between that first Shout set and then when Shout did them separately in like 2016, 2017. Because basically what happened was in the Blu-ray.com forums, I think it was actually Cliff McMillan who was posting in there, who of course is, I'm probably going to get his title wrong. I think it was Director of Acquisitions for Shout and Scream Factory. And he was basically just blatantly asking the forums, hey, does anyone, know of the mono audio tracks for the Bruce Lee films? And I kind of just went, yeah, I do. I got stuff. And so admittedly, the audio tracks I was working with on those films, they were okay quality at the time. I mean, some people were saying that they were lossy and things like that. And basically, it was sort of a matter of doing the best I could with what I had at the time, because I didn't have access to some of the other audio sources that have since cropped up over the years. In fact, the Arrow set I know has like a ton of different sources that were used, which sound a lot better. So those who might have been a little skittish about the audio from the older releases should be happier with these. But yeah, so basically it was just, like, hey, does anybody have the thing with the stuff? And I just jumped in there. And next thing you know, I'm going through Big Boss, Fist of Fury, Way the Dragon, Game of Death, just trying to get as much audio for all these films together. And, trying to maneuver different music tracks and things like that. And then you start realizing, like, what is considered to be the authentic audio track. Because, for example, when we were going over audio options for Fist of Fury in the Arrow set, we were listening to the English dub, and there's so many different minute changes that you start to pull your hair out. Like, all right, so which one's the actual proper one? Like, for example, if you listen to the American Chinese Connection version, like, the dub is the same, the music compositions are the same, the placement's a little different. And it's so weird. Like, for example, when, everyone at the Jingwu School is trying to find Chen Zhen before the finale, you start hearing the Fist of Fury theme kicking in while they're in the graveyard rather than when he's walking down the street. So when he's walking down the street, there's no music. But then in almost every other version of the dub, like the export dub, the Japanese release of the English dub, you hear the music when he's coming down the street, but not in the graveyard. So it's like, so it's very frustrating because, like, you can get a good quality source, but then you realize, oh crap, this might not be the right, most authentic version. So when I was working on, the Shout set, I was trying my best at the time to compile as much as I could that was authentic. And so, we had the Shout release in 2013, and that was sort of that. I thought, okay, well, that's my one foray into, Blu-rays and such of, a sort of Hong Kong films. Cool. What better way than, do the Bruce Lee movies? And then it was in 2016 that Cliff reached back out to me saying, hey, the Bruce Lee films were just restored in 4K by Le Magie Ritrovato. We still have the rights for a couple more years. We want to re-release them separately. Is there anything else you think we should put on these releases? And at the time, I was like, no, not really. I think I might try to, restore some of the TV spots or reconstruct the TV spots and trailers using the new restoration. And then on a whim, just because this is sort of like a bucket list thing for me, on a whim, I asked, can I do a commentary for The Big Boss? And I thought they were going to be like, nah. Because, they still had Mike Leader's commentaries on the 4 films from the 2013 set. So I just thought, okay, well, they're going to just do that. And basically, I just volunteered to do this commentary. I guess I can say that it was an unpaid gig, but that was because I just volunteered to do it. Like, I just wanted to do it. I just want to get it out there. So that's on me. So I'm not saying, oh, Shout didn't pay me, because, I was paid for the first set. But for the commentary, it was me just volunteering to get it out there. And it's funny because, and I've noticed this from other people too, when they do their first solo commentaries, you quickly learn how difficult they can be. Because when you're with somebody else, like me with Mike Leader, you bounce off of each other and then you just bring up new topics to discuss. When you're solo, even if it's your favorite film, even if you've studied it inside and out, you can still kind of like glitch up and go, oh God, what do I say here? And the funny thing is, when I did that first Big Boss commentary in 2016, I basically just bullet pointed notes that were like 6 or 7 pages and then kind of just ran from there. And I recorded that whole thing on a lavalier mic, like sitting on a light stand in my home office in my townhouse that I had at the time. So yeah, if you go back and listen to that one, it sounds a hair reverby compared to my later commentaries or much later commentaries.
It's still pretty good. And I know that, like, Mike's, I think, was very frustrated with the quality. I think there was a bunch of technical problems when he was putting together his tracks. And I think when Criterion ported them over, I don't think there was a huge amount they could do to kind of really improve. So it kind of sounds like, I think they're fine on headphones. I think he's a too harsh a critic based on the quality of his later ones. And what he's saying is fantastic, but it does sound a little bit like he's kind of speaking into a tin cup or something.
Yes.
Just a little bit muffled.
I actually asked him about that, and I don't still remember what it was, because I wasn't sure if it was a compression issue, noise reduction issue, audio sampling issue. So he wasn't too enthused with how that turned out, because he said something like, "Oh, well, this is how they said it should be recorded, so that's what I did," and he sent it to them, and that was that. But yeah, Big Boss at the time was the only one I wanted to do, just because it's my favorite film. It's the one I knew most about, so I just kind of gave it a shot, and that was that. And so, like I said, they had the Shout solo releases in 2016, 2017. And then I think it was in 2019, in summer 2019, that I was given the heads up that Criterion got the US rights after Shout's rights lapsed. And so that's when I was wondering, it's like, are they going to, port over the old commentaries? And then they did. And like I said, that was when more people heard my commentary than before, because Criterion's pretty on top of promoting certain releases and the extras and things like that, while Shout is very rapid fire. Like, hey, this thing's coming out at this point, this this movie's coming out here, that show's coming out then. While Criterion's like once a month, like usually the middle of the month, like, hey, we're releasing these 4 to 6 releases. And I think just the combination of seeing Bruce Lee and Criterion just made people go, oh my god. And so that was kind of where that really picked up. But the funny thing is, I feel like my actual return to that was with the 88 Films release of Hero Shed No Tears.
Okay.
And I was already starting to kind of creep into helping the UK labels. It was either like late 2018, early 2019, where I'm probably going to pronounce the number in his name wrong. I forgot. It was Iron God 2112 or Iron God 2112. If you're listening, I apologize. I can't remember how you want the numbers pronounced. Because he pointed that out to me one time. It's like, oh, it's pronounced this way. It's like, sorry. But he was the one who got in touch with me to start helping with the audio on some of the releases later on. And so with that, I think 88 Films was trying to find someone to do a commentary for Heroes Shed No Tears. And I was already kind of helping on one aspect. And they're like, well, this guy did a commentary for The Big Boss. Let's see if he wants to do it. And so, of course, my knee-jerk reaction was like, yeah, sure. And then the other part of me went, I don't think I've watched this film in almost 20 years. So I had to do the deepest of dives to find any information on that one. And then that's how I ended up stumbling upon the Korean version of that film, which is, a whole other story. But so it kind of just snowballed from there. And it's funny because, the whole commentary thing kind of just came about. Like I was doing a lot for 88 Films, basically, Hero Shed No Tears, the first release of New Fist of Fury, Shaolin Wooden Men, and one of my favorite ones was The Young Master as well. So and then of course I did, oh my god, how many commentaries so far this year? Although I think I'm taking a break from solo commentaries this year after the New Fist of Fury. But I want to say it was 5 solo commentaries I've done this year. My brain is mushier than usual now. So, but I digress.
Well, an amazing comment. I'm glad you mentioned it, because the original kind of 88 Films release of New Fist of Fury, you sat down with one of my favorite people on the planet. You sat down with Kung Fu Bob for that commentary. Indeed. Which I really adore. It was really very, very good. I think
we went remote on that one. So yes, it's funny because normally I'll do them with Mike whenever I do duo commentaries. And of course, he's in Hong Kong, so he and I have to try to schedule when we have enough time to talk about a movie between a 12 to 13 hour time difference, especially if it's if we have sprung forward or not here in the US with a daylight savings time. So it's is it 12 or 13? I forget. But with Bob, the funny thing with Bob is that he's only I think 3-4 hours from me, but we still did a remote just because that was just going to be quicker to jump in, talk about the movie, and then jump back out, rather than one or the other person, driving, across, a couple states to do that. Not even a couple. I think he's only 1 state away from me. But we did that one remote, and I kind of just gave him the heads up, hey, these are the spots that I'm going to touch upon, whatever you want to talk about, jump in there, just let me know. And that was a lot of fun doing that one. For the US version of New Fist of Fury didn't quite have that time. Arrow gives you a lot of time, but there's still moments where it's like, okay, I need to just like prep this and get this thing ready. And so, because the funny thing is, Bob and I, there are a couple other times we talked about doing other commentaries. Like at one point, we wanted to do one for Armor of God, and time was just not on our side. You know, he was working on more covers, and then I was prepping some other Blu-ray stuff. So trying to get the stars to align was very tricky. But no, it was a lot of fun doing the 80 films commentary with him. So.
Yeah. But I'm very intrigued to see. We mentioned it, so I should bring up the picture while I have the picture, because Arrow's release of New Fist of Fury, which I think people are always very quick, particularly on the forums, to moan about things coming out from different labels. But I think they always forget that at that point in time, the 88 Films releases were UK only. It was region B locked. So many people in the States don't have multi-region machines.
No,
and certainly don't want to import stuff. So it makes very kind of, I think, to anyone who's aware of how the rights issues work kind of between stateside and the UK, I think America's a massive marketplace, and I was kind of very happy actually to kind of see Arrow kind of putting this out themselves as a US exclusive. I think it looks like a great release. You've done a video essay for it as well, haven't you?
Yeah, so the funny thing about that is, a little side note there, is that the essay I did was also for the Bruce Lee set for Arrow.
Okay.
So basically, whether you're a UK fan or a US fan, there's going to be a way to see this video essay, because it was actually James's idea. It's like, hey, why don't you do a video essay that talks about the differences and similarities between New Fist of Fury and Fist of Fury Part 2? Because technically speaking, they're both unofficial sequels. Like, New Fist of Fury is closer to being official because it's directed by Lo Wei, and you have a couple of returning actors from it. But ironically, even Fist of Fury Part 2 has some returning actors from the original Fist of Fury. So a little bit of overlap there. But yeah, so I first did it for the Bruce Lee set, and then James like, hey, we're also going to put it on the US New Fist of Fury release. You know, since they're different region releases. I was like, oh, cool. So, you know, some people can see that one. Granted, as of now, there's no US release that's going to have my Big Boss video essay, but, you know, maybe in the future, who knows? But yeah, no, with this, might as well dive a little more into the Arrow release of New Fist of Fury. What's funny is, one thing I always thought about as an American fan is that the Lo Wei era films were almost always bundled together by the same company. You know, whether like here in the US, you had like the first one I remember is All Seasons Entertainment with those big box VHS releases. And then like going into the DVD era, you had Scimitar, which, you know, it was better quality than the VHS releases, but not by much. They were still full screen, but typically taken from better masters than the VHS versions. And then Sony, of all people, jumped into it in the Columbia TriStar line when they were doing the seasonal films like Drunken Master and Snake and Eagle Shadow. But they had all the Lo Wei films too. And at first they were actually kind of putting effort into them, like, you know, the Fearless Hyena films, New Fist of Fury, which are the ones were actually properly released. Like, these had like proper like widescreen 2.35 releases. And then I think when you get the Shaolin Woodmen, it was like a dated half widescreen version. I think Killer Meteors or Half-Life of Kung Fu, one of those, if not both, were just full screen. So at that point, Sony just kind of gave up. They released them all. I think the only one that didn't come out, which is always the one that may or may not be included, is Magnificent Bodyguards. And I think that's also just because of the weird 3D thing that some of the companies are just like, no, we're not gonna deal with that. Oh, you have a 2D version? No, we don't care. It's fine. Just go away. So yeah, that was always like sort of the outlier, which still kind of seems to be the case at the moment. But yeah, so Sony dove in, and then I think the last time the Lo Wei era films had any sort of US release was, fun enough, from Shout Factory on DVD. They were doing, I think they called them the Jackie Chan Beginnings, I think. I could be wrong. And they're like little double feature DVD sets. And so, but still, like, they're always owned by the same company. So this is sort of uncharted territory because, you know, Shout put out a bunch of the Lo Wei era films in the Volume 1 set from this year. And now Arrow's doing New Fist of Fury. And there's going to be more of the Lo Wei era films that has been not quite announced yet from somebody else, but enough sleuthing online, people have figured out who it is. But that's all I'm going to say at the moment. And it's not really a big surprise, but still, it's like multiple companies now have the Lo Wei era Jackie Chan films, which is so bizarre to see at this point. It's like you're splitting up the family, because my guess is like they probably used to be like bulk
package
licensed.
deal.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like before Forza Star had the rights to them. I think that's part of why that happened. Because I think I don't know if like the Low-Way studio was actually licensing them out to whoever could just grab them back then in like a lump sum. But I do think in this modern era with Forza Star having those films, that Forza Star kind of like doing rights to, the highest bidder, for lack of a better term, I do think that might be part of the reason why like some companies have, these films, some companies have those films. But no, I think Arrow, I don't want to say they lucked out with this, but I think that they wanted some synergy with the Bruce Lee set, obviously with the Tony Stolla artwork here. Because like it is kind of complicated because of course Bruce Lee set is UK only. New Fist Fury is US only, at least in regards to Arrow. But at the same time, we also try to differentiate from the 88 Films version. So while it does still have the 2 cuts of the film, which was, it was mandatory, it's like, get the longer cut, the shorter cut. The other thing is, aside from having the original mono tracks that we already had previously, one other thing is that both, let me not mix myself up here. So first of all, both cuts of the film have new commentaries. I believe Frank Jang and Michael Worth did the longer cut. And I kind of threw my hat into the ring because I had previously done the commentary for the longer cut with Kung Fu Bob. And I thought, well, maybe I can do the shorter cut this time. It's literally like 82, 83 minutes. So that's why I decided to do the shorter version this time, because it's like, okay, I kind of have time to do this version. So this isn't too bad. But the interesting thing is that months ago when I found out that Arrow was going to do this, actually going back even further, it wasn't long after I finished the 88 Films version that I found out that either late 80s or early 90s, there was a VCD that had a Cantonese dub made for the longer cut of the film. And so I was kind of kicking myself about that because only the shorter cut had a Cantonese dub, because that was the official Cantonese dub done by, the Low-Way company at the time. While this one, I think, might have been commissioned by Ocean Shores. And what's funny about this version is that anytime they still needed music while they're dubbing in the new dialogue, they kind of just pulled music from wherever, and it even uses some music cues from Project A. So it's a very interesting audio track to listen to. Like, I don't know which version people will prefer to watch because, New Fist of Fury, the pacing of that film leaves a little more to be desired. But if they do watch the 2-hour cut, and then they listen to the new Cantonese track, well, newer, probably from like the early 90s. It's a very interesting listen. But the other thing that I stumbled upon by accident, because I was prioritizing trying to prep that Cantonese track for the longer cut, I decided to listen to the Mandarin track on there on a whim, just to see if the quality was any better or worse. And I want to say the quality was on par, but here's the kicker. As I was comparing the two, sometimes I'll do this thing where I'll listen in like multiple channels just to see if there's any overlap with like sound effects or different music or whatever. There were different line readings in the Mandarin tracks. So there was the Mandarin dub that Forza Star had, that Sony had. That was pretty much the same track. This, on the other hand, every once in a blue moon, there would be different dialogue. It wasn't like it was recorded in the 90s. Like the quality and most of the voice actors sounded the same. But with my rudimentary Mandarin skills, I could tell in this other dub that they were using the terms Zhongguo and Yibuyan, and so they're saying like, oh, the Chinese, the Japanese. So I'm thinking, I don't know which track was considered the original dub and which one was like the slightly tweaked dub, like maybe a year later in like 77 instead of 76, where it seemed like it might have been a little more racially charged. And I think Low-Way or somebody at his company kind of backpedaled like, hey, maybe this is sounding a little too harsh, like kind of like smooth out some of these lines, like
could it have been for the film going out into Japan?
Well, that's the weird thing. The Japanese release, and I actually talk about this in the commentary, is that I didn't know this for years because I think a lot of people assume that the shorter cut was made by Fortune Star when it first started sneaking out on, I think it was the Hong Kong Legends DVD, that people were like, why is this like 80 minutes? What the hell's going on? So I have the Japanese Laserdisc, and I think the Japanese VHS is the same because they have the same artwork at the very least. The funny thing is, I think when it was finally released in Japan, it was the shorter cut in Cantonese. So not even that. So they might have been preemptively trying to do that and couldn't get a bite at the time. And I don't think the Japanese releases were closer to like the end of the 70s or early 80s. I could be mistaken. So it's sort of like a weird scenario. So, but the funny thing is, we weren't sure which track to refer to in regards to the Mandarin track, which one we should refer to as the original line reads versus the redub, because it was more speculation than knowing for sure. So we didn't want to say, oh no, this is definitely the original version. And then someone later on going, yeah, no, you're wrong. So we're just like, hey, we have two versions of the Mandarin dub, because most of it's the same, but there are different time codes where you can like hear a difference in the line reads. Like I said, some of the voice actors sound the same. Some sound like they couldn't get the same people back. Like Nora Miao's voice actress sounds the same in both versions. While I think it's Chun Kam, whenever he was redubbed, it sounds a little different.
Okay.
But yeah, it was one of those things where it's like you're researching tracks and suddenly you find something else. So you're like, I guess we'll put this on here too. So there you go. Just the more the merrier. So, but yeah, that's a little bit of background info on the Arrow version of New Fist Fury. So as always, we try to make sure that there's new things in the event that the multi-region fans are like, why should I get this version? It's like, well, first of all, it's not meant for you, but if you want to, you can, because it's got A, B, C, D, E. So, we still strive for the multi-region crowd, but at the same time, it's like, hey, we know you don't have access to this in region A yet. So we did these things too. So we try to think of both in those scenarios, because we don't want to be like, oh, this isn't meant for you. But like you said, there are times where people don't quite understand why, different companies release the same films, because, especially if it's the multi-region companies like Arrow, like 88 Films, because they do both now. So there are times where, a title will have a UK release. Like, for example, off the top of my head, Magnificent Warriors had a UK release from Eureka, and 88 announced, I can't remember who announced first, but whoever the second company was, that was when everybody went, oh, but I thought this other company was releasing it. Are they both releasing in the UK? Because they don't read the part that says US only release or region B only release or things like that. Because with 88 and Arrow, sometimes it can get confusing, because they see those company names and the knee-jerk reaction is, oh, it's UK release. Not always, like New Fist of Fury. It's like, oh, I thought 88 released that. They did. Arrow's releasing in the US. So, but yeah.
And we see the same thing happening to a degree with Criterion too, because I mean, the Criterion set, which I should bring up too, just before we move on and look more at Arrow. But when this first came out, this was US only. Yeah. And it's still US only, obviously, even for more obvious reasons now that Arrow's got the rights. But at that point, I think Medium Rare had acquired the rights from the old Hong Kong Legends versions, really. And it's a pretty horrible box set. But yeah, for those of us in the UK, the Criterion set, this is why I bought a multi-region machine originally, really. Up until before this, I'd been using PlayStation for Blu-rays. Hadn't really been any sort of point. I think it was a PlayStation 3 way back in time. But this was the thing really that was like, okay, I need to shore up and actually kind of allow myself access to some of these releases, because I think Criterion do put out some releases on both sides of the Atlantic, usually not at the same time. Like recently they did the Infernal Affairs box set on in the States and in the UK, but certainly the Bruce Lee set was always a US release only. So I kind of it's something that I'm just sort of accepting is part of the way the world works, and it's never something I take personally, the way that a huge amount of people seem to, as if they're somehow being victimized for where they live. That's never the case. No. But it has really, I mean, it's an incredible set that I think up until we knew more about what Arrow had up their sleeve, it's been my sort of go-to recommendation anytime that anyone was asking about the Bruce Lee movies, because that medium rare set's really quite woefully bad. It really just essentially just upscales an awful lot of the Hong Kong Legend stuff. And
it's like when you ask, or someone asks you how you want your steak done. Do you want it done medium rare or well done? And it's like, well, I want my Blu-ray set well done, but I guess it'll be medium rare. So read that how you will. But anyway,
and we should jump on, because I'm curious, without kind of wanting to get too techie, but you've mentioned a little bit when you've been working on the audio elements, and I was going to kind of maybe bring us on quite naturally to a couple of the movies that you had done assembly edits for.
Yes.
And so I was a massive fan. One of my favorite Samuel movies is Millionaires Express, and this was something that we've been lucky enough to see coming out in both regions. So the UK, we've got the Eureka version, and then obviously the States got the Arrow version, right? But I think it's your same work is on both releases.
Yes.
And in a situation like that, how are you getting the elements? Because I mean, I'm old school to a point where when digital editing first came out, the file sizes were way too big back then to kind of really process in any sort of meaningful way. So even if you're working on like a big Avid system, you were working in a relatively low res, small file size, just saving a kind of queue list really. And then you'd hope that when you transferred to try and do a final assembly, that everything would line up.
Yeah.
Could you sort of talk a little bit about how the process is kind of going in terms of what you're getting if you're getting a hard drive that's 500 terabytes? Or
So I would say that typically with these films we have ProRes files, and so these are pretty beefy, not quite that big. They're not terabytes, but they are very high quality. So basically, these are typically like actual 2K files. But the funny thing is, one thing to kind of like compensate for that size is that typically when you get a 2K file of a film that was shot in 2.35 or 2.39 or scope widescreen, basically, you don't have the black bars in your video file. Like you literally have, just the film itself, no, it's not a 16:9 video basically. So basically once it's put on the Blu-ray, then it's formatted for 16:9. So that already helps a little bit. Granted, there's not much like compression needed for black bars, but still, the less to deal with, the better. And typically those files range around, I want to say like 100 gigs just for like an hour and a half film roughly. Which, is obviously much more substantial than the Blu-ray itself, because a double layer Blu-ray is like 50 gigs, but obviously that's not just the movie. Typically it's not just the movie. Because, a lot of these Blu-rays are probably like between 35 and 45 gigs worth of data, which is the movie and all the files. And quickly, I want to give a preemptive shout out to Dave McKenzie at Fidelity in Motion, who works on a lot of these Blu-rays. I am going to bring him back up when we talk about righting wrongs, because he's just as much to thank for that as I am, but we'll get to that momentarily. But for Millionaires Express, funny enough, that's another one where I have to bring up Iron God, because it was actually his idea, where he's like, hey, do you think we can do a hybrid cut of this? And I thought, well, from what I've seen of the two versions, I don't think there's anything that's considered like alternate footage. Like, there's like scenes that are in one version that aren't in another, and vice versa. But they're not alternate in the sense that like, oh, well, this scene's in here instead because it changes this thing here. Like, no, it's just, hey, we have these scenes in this version and we have these scenes in that version. Let's, put them together in what should be their chronological order. And, there you go. And so the great thing is that I kind of jump around with the software that I use. You have, Adobe Premiere. You have what used to be Sony Vegas. It's now Magix Vegas. I don't know when that changed. So I use both those a lot. And so basically, the great thing is that it handles ProRes files pretty well. So I can just drop them in and then line them up.
This is a super geeky question, but didn't ProRes start as kind of like an Apple codec?
Well, that's the funny thing, because the ProRes files typically are .mov files. So it basically does kind of rub elbows with that, if not blatantly, QuickTime. Because there are times where, I'll look at that, and I think it was an older version of Vegas, if I'm not mistaken, where it didn't even show like intermediate as an option. It would just be like QuickTime. It was either Vegas or Premiere that said, oh, go to QuickTime. And then you go in there and suddenly you would see an option for ProRes at the same resolution, at the same file size and everything. It's like, oh, I guess this is ProRes. And then later on, I think Magix had their version called Magix Intermediate, which is, once again, ProRes. But it's technically just a really big QuickTime file. It's an MOV file. And so, the great thing about those is that's pretty much like the final file from Fortune Star. So basically, like when it's sent to me, like there's no resolution loss. So I'm able to work with that. And then I export it back out in ProRes. Funny enough, I actually had to do that a few times at the Bruce Lee set, but for Arrow, but we'll get to that momentarily too. But with Millionaires Express, that was just, if it wasn't for Iron God, I probably wouldn't have had a shot at doing that. But that's something that was in the back of my mind, because funny enough, I originally wanted to do that for Dragon Lord for 88 Films. And we didn't really have the time or the disk space to do that. So that kind of just sat in the back of my my brain. It's like, oh yeah, what's that thing in my skull? My brain, I forget about it. And so funny enough, on a whim, I was actually able to do that for the Shout Factory Jackie Chan Volume 1 set when Dragon Lord was in there. It's like, let me see if I can do that. granted, the funny thing about that is, since it already has the Hong Kong cut, the first earlier longer cut, they couldn't fit it on that disc. So a lot of people got confused, including myself, when I was trying to like see how the discs were being set up, that they snuck it onto the Killer Meteors disc because that's all they had room for at that point. Yeah. So I got to do Dragon Lord. So the Dragon Lord was the first one I thought about doing that, but didn't get to do it. But the Millionaires Express was the first one where I actually finally got to put that together. And yeah, I was pleasantly surprised when Arrow basically was able to port that over for the US release, because typically when I do like big projects like that, they kind of just sit in the UK. And then, you know, a lot of my friends here in the US are like, oh, I can't watch that. It's like, well, get a multi-region player, like you said. And a lot of them just don't feel like doing that. So then, once again, like you said, when, you know, a US release comes out, they finally have the chance to see that. So I was very excited when Arrow was putting out Millionaires Express in the US with my hybrid cut as one of the options. So that was very flattering. So I was very, very happy about that.
And we should maybe say, just for the sake of like a public service announcement, there is a degree of kind of like healthy camaraderie between Eureka and Arrow. So even to the point where I think if you take the disc for the Angela Mouse set, if you take if you have a multi-region machine, you can change the region coding on your menu. Screen will shift between you. If you have a region, if you're set to region B, you'll see the Eureka menu. If you set to region A, you'll see it's literally the same, exactly the same kind of disc coding.
So the funny thing about that is the first one I actually found out about wasn't even the Angela Mouse set. It was actually running out of time.
Okay.
So that was the first one where everybody went, why am I seeing this logo on this set? What's going on here? Because I forgot who released it first. It might have been the Eureka release and then the Arrow release.
Yeah.
But yeah, when someone popped in the Eureka disc into, I think it might have been an American fan who got the Eureka disc, put it in, but forgot to change the region coding back. So it's still on A. And then suddenly the Arrow logos came up. They're like, because it was already announced that Arrow was going to do that, because I think it was one of those instances where Eureka announced, and then Arrow's like, oh, hey, we're going to do US release too. Don't feel like you need to import. So basically the reasoning behind that is, for those who don't know, is that it basically saves money on disk replication, because the only thing is that it uses seamless branching. So basically when you pop the disk into the player, it detects what region it is, and so it'll branch to, you know, the opening logo on the disc and then the menu that's going to be on there. So the funny thing is, I didn't even know that branching could be used for different regions until recently, because another example was actually the 88 Films release of Flying Guillotine 2, in which it still had BBFC cuts, but this was going to be a multi-region release. And obviously they didn't want to release the UK cut version in the US. So what do? They use seamless branching and region coding detecting to get around that. I think it's like one scene where they're like poking at a fish or something.
It's usually animal cruelty. The BBFC, the BBFC are fine with you maiming, hurting, and killing human beings, but they're not super into kind of anything that happens with animals.
Simulation versus a real thing. I can understand that aspect. But yeah, so I didn't even know that was a thing that you could do. But at the same time, it also makes perfect sense. So it's like, hey, if this disk is detecting this region code, play this order of files. If it's detecting that region code, play that order of files. So as of now, I think only the Running Out of Time set and the Angela Mouse set are the only ones off the top of my head where they were multi-region. Right. Because basically it was a cheaper option for both companies, but also you're still getting the same quality. And it basically works for everyone. And like you said, I think the other thing that people don't take into account, even if they are multi-region, is paying for shipping. So because you can end up adding like an extra 5, 10, 15, depending on if you get like a box set, that's going to just really jack up the shipping really fast. So it's like if Arrow's going to put out a Shaw Scope set, which are pretty beefy boys, if you're in the US, get the US set, don't get the UK one, and vice versa, because you're just going to pay more for shipping for the exact same thing that you're going to get in your region.
Because Arrow do also, for their US releases, they're not manufacturing them in the UK. I think they've got a separate manufacturing station that's stateside. That's also producing the stuff. And I think one thing, again, for public service announcement point of view, because I think it's a big factor, particularly when release dates shift. Yeah. And people always kind of get very frustrated about that. We had really bad riots in the UK about maybe 10 years ago in London. And one of the victims of it was Sony's processing plant, where they replicated a huge amount of Blu-rays. So that's why increasingly most places are using the same replication house. And I think it's one in Europe. We used to have one in the UK. We currently don't, because Sony can't or haven't got that back up and running again. So it's made it, there's now an awful lot more people fighting for that same slot at a duplication house. So I think, there's a lot of reasons, because again, I see people always lose their minds when a set is announced for dual release and American markets get it first. They're like, but it's like, well, guys, it's coming from a different place and it's got a lot less space to ship. It's crazy.
Oh yeah, like the funny thing is, working on these releases, you start to learn all the ins and outs and why things are the way they are. And it's funny because, I'm sure if I go far enough back in the Blu-ray.com forums, like over 10 years ago, I'm sure I was that same person who would, whine about certain things. But then when you're in the thick of it, you're like, oh, that's why. Oh, this is why. Oh, I get all these things now. Yeah. And so I've become more like sympathetic to a lot of those things. Granted, there are some delays that I've seen. I won't name any companies. Most of the fans probably know which company it is, but where there's a lot of delays. And to be fair, like you said, sometimes it is because of a disc replication thing, but other times it can also just be because sometimes you have hurry and wait moments, but then you also have wait then hurry moments. And I've been on both ends of that spectrum. Like there was one title I worked on last year. It's since been released by this company in question. I finished my work last August, and I think it finally came out a few months ago. So that was a case of hurry and wait. It's like, oh no, we need the audio tracks. We need the audio tracks. Then suddenly you're like, okay, well, I know I didn't cause it to be delayed this long. So something else is going on. And even Frank Jang has kind of said the same thing sometimes, where he'll blame himself, like, oh, I feel like it's my fault that this got delayed because of my commentary. But to be fair on Frank's part, though, as much as I complain about trying to get my solo commentaries done, he just cranks them out. And I'm just sitting here like, I'm just sitting in the corner eating paste compared to him, and he's just like knocking out all these commentaries. But then he frets.
That man's a machine.
Absolutely.
And sleeps up, somehow seems to survive on like 2.5 hours sleep a night.
I can't do that. At least not anymore. Like if I get 6 hours, I can still be sluggish, but I can still kind of pull that off. It's very interesting watching behind the scenes and like what works. And like you said, with the UK based companies doing US releases, a lot of them do use the same company to get them out, which funny enough is another company that also does their own Blu-rays here in the US. So there'll be times where if I get a comp copy of a Blu-ray that's from a UK company that has a US release, I'll see that same label on the sticker, whether it was a comp from 88 for a US release or from Error for a US release, it was all the same company. But like you said, that's just
MVD, I think it's in the States, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So it's sort of a case of working smarter, not harder, because I feel like that's how these companies are able to spread their wings out much more than they would have, years ago. Because the funny thing is, looking back, I keep making this joke whenever Arrow does a US release, because 9 times out of 10, it was a title that Fox had put on DVD here in the US years ago. Like, what was the last one? Warriors 2. That's the next one that's coming out, I think, because that was also a Fox title. And there's a few others that they've done that were previously Fox releases. I'm blanking on. Well, the funny thing is, Millionaires Express, that was Dragon Dynasty, but still, like, most of them were Fox. But I joke about the fact that here in the US, years ago, like in the DVD era, you really didn't have that same sort of like back and forth with the UK companies and the US companies, because in the UK, obviously, it was mainly Hong Kong Legends. Here in the US, it was kind of just whoever. It was Fox doing their line. It was, Dragon Dynasty doing their thing.
And Funimation were in there with the Shaw stuff.
Yeah. And it's so funny because with Funimation, I've talked about how there's still some titles that Funimation put out that still have not had a Blu-ray release. Most
Godfather.
Exactly. That was the one I was going to say. Like I've joked with people that I have a death grip on my DVD because so many people want Hong Kong Godfather on Blu-ray and no one's put it out yet. And I don't know why. And because like I've worked essentially with all the companies that have done Shaw Brothers on Blu-ray at this point, and no one's putting out Hong Kong Godfather. Like I turn back into like a fan rather than a collaborator, just going like, can you all do Hong Kong Godfather? Like, no, we're going to do these titles instead. It's like, yeah, those are great titles. Can you do Hong Kong Godfather, please? Because it's just, it's just sitting on DVD. Like, it didn't even get a Hong Kong DVD release. Like, I'm 90% certain that the Funimation DVD is the only way you can get the remastered version from Celestial. Because the only other DVD that came out was a bootleg taken from a cut Taiwanese version and Mandarin. So
I was going to say, I think there might be a Deltamac release of it, which is semi-official. Deltamac did the Taiwanese releases of that, because don't quote me.
I don't remember there being an IVL Hong Kong release.
No, I don't think so.
So weird. Like that was one of the few that did not get one. Like I think that And To Kill a Mastermind also has not had a proper official release anywhere. I think it's one of those titles I think like showed up on whatever that Shaw Brothers like cable box streaming thing is.
Oh, the Zeagle.
There you go. Yeah, that was it. I think it showed up on there, and that was it. No physical release.
I think in 480p, I think it'd be like a postage stamp site.
I mean, that's still better than like a VHS bootleg, but yeah.
So I really hope it's not a popular opinion, but I think disc 7 on Shawscope Volume, maybe like on Shawscope Volume 2, has Mercenaries from Hong Kong, and I thought that would have been the most amazing double bill of Mercenaries from Hong Kong with Hong Kong Godfather. Would have been sublime. I know lots of people love Boxer's Omen. It's not quite my cup of tea. There's other Shaw's horrors that I love a bit more, and that seemed like a curious mix. But see, I held out a little bit of hope, and I still hold out hope that at some point Arrow will turn their attention to it. For those that don't know, it's one of the few films directed by legendary Shaw Brothers villain actor by Wang Lung-wei.
Oh yeah,
he was behind the camera for it, and it's still pretty harsh, brutal, very violent.
It very much holds up, and that's another reason why I think it needs release. I know one company that's been doing Shaw Brothers releases blatantly told me, "Yeah, we don't have the rights to that one." So it's implying that somebody does, but I'll believe it when I see it, because like I'll be the first to say I have not heard anything official from anybody that has any of the Shaw Brothers films. But and that's what makes me sad. I think it's just because it's got more of a cult following than some of the more popular ones that have been released, like King Boxer and 36 Chamber and all those. Like everyone knows those. But yeah, I would love for those who haven't seen Hong Kong Godfather, because that's the other thing. It's out of print. You can't find it unless you go on eBay and spend at least $60 for a used DVD.
Yeah,
that's the only way you can get it. And people, to this day, people keep posting that clip on Twitter of the kid just getting launched through the window. And it's like, it's turning into a meme. So we need to get it on Blu-ray soon and, strike while the iron's hot. But,
I forget the name of that little actor, but he's really cool. He's also in another film that desperately needs to be released. He's in Demon of the Loot, which is like kind of so wonderful. And I think he's got a bit more to do, and it's a little bit more of a wholesome performance. He doesn't meet such a horrific end.
What do you mean Hong Kong Godfather isn't wholesome?
Anyway. to folks like us, but we mentioned before we jump too far in, because I could fall down that rabbit hole for days, but we mentioned seamless branching, so I would be remiss, and also this ties up a little bit with what we were speaking about with potential delays from some unknown company that might have numbers in their title. But let's speak a little bit about Righting Wrongs, because that was I was before you'd said what you said about seamless branching being used to allow them to basically do 2 regions on one disc with different menus. I'd kind of assumed that Righting Wrongs was the first big use of seamless branching to kind of feature multiple endings.
I think, at least in regards to like Hong Kong titles, because like seamless branching has been a thing for quite a while, just in general. I can't remember like what some of the first DVDs that did it were.
Like might have been,
what was that?
I was wondering if it was maybe the Abyss, that kind of old version that when you got, and some of the Alien box sets where they were using them to do the different cuts.
So it was either the Alien set or Terminator 2.
Yeah.
So something James Cameron adjacent at the very least, whether it's Aliens or Terminator 2. But yeah, so like even back then, like that concept just intrigued me, because we couldn't even get multiple audio tracks on a VHS tape. Which is why, like, let's really take it back to like the Tai Sang era, where it's like, oh, you want it dubbed or you want it subtitled? Yes, I want both. No, you get one or the other. That's it. So the fact that you could even have multiple versions on the same disc just like blew my mind, because I first got DVD like pretty early in its infancy. It was like 1999, so like, it was only around for like a year and a half or 2 years. And so.
I think I still remember the pain of how much that DVD player cost me at that point. I think I had to take out like an interest-free, or in fact, I don't think it was interest-free, like a higher purchase deal, because that was probably £500 back then in 1999, and not the most amazing player even.
Like I remember our first one was a Toshiba that could only do DVDs and CDs, and that was it. If you tried a CD or a VCD or a DVD-R, once those became more of a thing, it wasn't happening. Like you had DVDs, CDs, done. Now, I have a PS5, which can play like everything under the sun. It's like I joke with people that if you get a 4K player, most 4K players are going to play 4K, Blu-ray, DVD, VCD, CD, and probably a few other things too, on top of like DVD-R, BDR, and things like that, which actually comes in handy when you're doing like a QC work. Like you can like burn the files to a disk and then check it out and then actually watch it on a disc, rather than waiting for QC version to be sent to you in the mail. Although some companies still do that, but it's neither here nor there. But righting wrongs. So you're asking about that. So the funny thing with this was I knew once 88 got the rights to this one that I wanted to attempt something with it. I think they were already dabbling with branching at the time, but at the very least I thought, okay, well, if we don't have access to branching, what I'll do at the very least is do a hybrid cut, because I can still put all these scenes together and they don't really interfere with each other. The biggest difference between this and Millionaires Express, unfortunately, is that despite our research, we could not find Cantonese dialogue for those extra scenes from the Mandarin version. So that was like hurdle number one that we just tripped over because we didn't really have another choice. But then the other thing was like, okay, the elephant in the room, what do we do about the ending or endings, really? Yeah. It's like, okay, well, I think what we could do is just say, screw it, and we'll just have the Hong Kong ending, the original, the first release ending where, spoiler alert, everyone dies. So it's like, okay, if push comes to shove, we'll just do that. But then when we realized we still had access to Dave McKenzie at Fidelity in Motion, and they already wanted to do branching anyway, just to kind of save on file size space between the two cuts, I thought, can I do the hybrid cut but then have multiple endings? And then I don't know where it came from that I decided I'm going to make 2 more endings that are unofficial and then do an ending randomizer. Yeah. So this was basically meant to surprise people who've seen both versions of the film, because typically when you see Cynthia Rothrock's fate, you know what's going to happen. Yeah. If she dies, Yumbu dies. If she lives, Yumbu lives. But now I'm like, nope, screw that. Now you have no idea. So she could live and then he could die and vice versa. So I thought, okay, they're not going to go for this. This is way too crazy. And in fact, I think there might have been someone behind the scenes who was like, but then I think the majority of the people working on the project were like, you know what? Let's do it. Let's do this. Why not? And so they went ahead with it and they let me do my thing. So the first thing was to make the initial hybrid cut before the ending. And so I went through and I tried to see like what scenes would go where, even if some of the things were a little different. Like I said, like Millionaires Express, it wasn't a case of like, oh, this is alternate footage. Like yes and no, but not until the ending where it's truly alternate. Yeah. And so, I took the 2 ProRes files. I tried to line up where the scenes should be. And then we got to the ending, and then we figured out like where we need to cut off for the branching. And Dave McKenzie's great because the thing with me is I preemptively was like, well, maybe I should make all 4 endings start at the beginning of the finale at the airplane hangar. In his case, it's like right down to the line where it's like when Rothrock is getting hit with the giant screw. It's like he got it like right there. The branching, you can't even tell. Like it's amazing. It's truly seamless. Exactly. Yeah. The funny thing is, I think depending on the player, you might hear something, but you don't see anything. So, and it's pretty seamless. Like actually on the TV, but like the player itself, you can kind of hear like you can hear the laser shifting to the other file. But on screen, it looks and sounds perfect. And so I couldn't believe that we were actually able to do that. And another elephant in the room, which I feel like I need to clear the air about a bit. Some people already know, like the whole thing's water under the bridge now for a multitude of reasons, was Vinegar Syndrome. So I was already spending months working on the 88 Films version, trying to work on the hybrid cut, the ending randomizer, the 2 unofficial endings and all these other things. And then lo and behold, Vinegar Syndrome is like, hey, we're doing our release of Righting Wrongs. I'm thinking, oh, shit. So at first I kind of like tried to reach out to them. It's like, hey guys, can we talk? Can we talk? And I just didn't hear anything at the time. And so at that moment, I was in sort of a weird place at the time, mentally speaking. So I got a little too competitive, and which was just dumb at the end of the day, just because once again, this was a UK release. The Vinegar Syndrome version is a US release, and Righting Wrongs didn't have a US release since like 2007, I think, from Dragon Dynasty. And prior to that was the Tai Seng release in the late 90s. So just seeing this getting another US release at all was great. Yeah. And, I was already a fan of Vinegar Syndrome. So I was just like in a really weird place at this point. Like, I'm a fan of this company, but I'm working on a different version of that. So for some reason, I just got competitive. And
that's understandable. I think the investment of time alone is kind of like you're working so hard for something that's yet to kind of see the light of day. And
I get it. I could have handled it a little better on my end. So, but like I said, it is water under the bridge. I mean, there's still a little bit of competition when we did Iceman Cometh. But at that point, things were kind of dying down, and I didn't want to repeat a Righting Wrongs because, like I said, I still love the work that Vinegar Syndrome was doing, and I really didn't want to, cause any further issues, especially the forums. The forums, like suddenly it was like, are you team idiot or team vinegar syndrome? I'm like, oh no, what have I done? What have I done? No, this is not what I want. So then I kind of came out. I was like, you know what? I was being a jackass. I was being way too competitive about it. And so, yeah, there are some barbs thrown back and forth, but at the end of the day, we all kind of just smoothed everything out. And, to jump ahead a little bit, now I ended up doing an audio commentary for one of their upcoming releases. So,
that's good to hear. Cool.
Yeah, so Undefeatable, which they just announced for their halfway to Black Friday sale. I got to do the alternate cut of Bloody Mary Killer, which was sort of like Godfrey Hoing himself, which is such a weird thing. So, and the cool thing is, I want to give a huge shout out to Justin LaLiberty at Vinegar Syndrome for actually giving me the chance to work on that. And the great thing was, he said, oh, if you want to do a commentary for both versions, that's great. But just as a heads up, we already had Cynthia Rothrock doing the Undefeatable version, the main cut of the film. So the priority would be Bloody Mary Killer if you could only do one cut. I said, you know what? That's perfectly fine. I only got so much time to do one right now anyway. And you have the star of the movie doing the main cut. I think that takes priority. I'll do the Bloody Mary Killer version, which I've seen a couple times in the past before, mainly on YouTube. So it's fun to revisit that. And also, I just really want to do it just because it was also just shot like a half hour from my hometown. So a lot of elements were very familiar to me watching that movie, even though it's like a pseudo Hong Kong film, but it was shot in Maryland here in the US. Or, Godfrey would have said, oh, I shot in DC. Like, no, you didn't. You shot in Maryland, about a half hour outside of DC. It's not DC. But I digress. I want to give a huge thanks once again to Justin. He's been great to work with. And I'm very excited to actually see the physical release in my hands, because I didn't even know till the week of announcement that it was going to be 4K. Like, I knew they're going to be on Blu-ray. I had no idea that Undefeatable was going to be 4K. Yeah. So even I was surprised.
I think they're shipping. I think that should ship pretty soon. I mean, kind of normally once they.
Yeah. So Vinegar Syndrome, whenever they do the halfway to Black Friday sale, usually it's by like mid to late June when they start shipping, because basically like everybody orders all these things. So then they need to kind of lock down their products, and then they do what's partners only, where basically it's like all these other companies that are indie companies as well that kind of work through Vinegar Syndrome. So basically for like a few weeks it's just those titles, while Vinegar Syndrome is like packing and shipping everything. In fact, they did a video where they're talking about film preservation, and I forgot the guy's name, but he's funny as hell if you watch any of the other videos on YouTube, where he's talking about like, hey, we're trying to ship your stuff out and we're trying to preserve films, but if you keep emailing us asking where's your order, we can't work on film restoration because we need to get everybody in the office to help ship everything out. So then it delays all these other products. So I was like, that's a good point. So, but no, they've been absolutely wonderful. So righting wrongs ended up being sort of a weird thing at the end of the day, but like I'm looking at my shelf and I have both now. The Idiot Films version right next to the Vinegar Syndrome version. So I have both versions.
And I know there's that, the Vinegar's got that really, really good kind of vintage documentary, which the title of which is escaping me just now. It's like the martial arts.
Yes. So that one's interesting. And so that it goes by a couple different titles. It's the best of the martial arts films, but also the deadliest art. So Best of the Martial Arts Films is the original title, like the export title, but it was first released here on VHS and even Laserdisc by Fox as the deadliest art, the Best of the Martial Arts Films. So they took the original title and made it a subtitle. Okay. But the tricky thing is the way Fortune Star mastered this was sort of weird, because their master basically just made every film 235 widescreen now. It's like, even
if it wasn't originally. So they
exactly. So that I think I can talk about this a little bit, because Iron God and I were saying that we do want to put that on a future UK title, but we haven't really confirmed which one it is. We're kind of hovering on a couple different ones. It might be a Eureka release, where I'm going to have my work cut out for me. I'm going to try to go back and reconstruct that whole thing with the proper ratios. I'm getting tired just thinking about it, because I know it's going to be a lot of work. Because the other really tricky thing about that is, if I do approach that, how do I want to present it? Because the thing is, when I first saw it years ago, well, actually I should say like in the DVD era and the Laserdisc era, there's two different ways it was presented. Because when it was shown in theaters, it was meant to be projected on a 2.35 wide screen. So any of the 16:9 films were pillar box. So you have black bars on the left and right side of the screen. And that's actually how the Universe Laser DVD was. So you'd watch it on a 4:3 TV back in the day, and you'd have the black bars on the top and bottom for the 235 footage. But then when you get to the 16:9 films, it was window box. So you still had the 2.35 black bars at the top and bottom, but then you still have the pillar boxing on the sides. It's not as egregious on a 16:9 screen, but even then you're still getting a little bit of window boxing around any of the 16:9 films. So it's like that's technically the authentic theatrical presentation, but the Fox Laserdisc did sort of like a pseudo pan and scan thing, but in a good way. Basically, any of the 16:9 films, they cropped in. Any of the 2.35 widescreen films, like, you know, the Bruce Lee films and most of the Jackie Chan films, you know, were just, you know, you had your thick black bars on the top and bottom on a 4:3 screen. But then when you get to more of the 16:9 stuff, for example, like Righting Wrongs, you would suddenly get like these black bars on the left and right side of the screen. And then that's because when it was in theaters, the whole thing was, you know, played at 2.35 on a, you know, full scope theatrical screen. So any of the 16:9 films had to be formatted to fit that screen, not taking into account, you know, television screens at home, you know, whether it's a 4:3 screen or even now a 16:9, because even on a 16:9 screen, it's less egregious, but you still get like a thin bar all around for those films.
Yeah, a little bit of pillar boxing.
Yeah. So the only release off the top of my head that kind of like worked around that was the Fox Laserdisc, which I didn't see until like maybe 2003, because I didn't get my own Laserdisc player until after the format had died. So, and I still buy Laserdiscs. I actually bought some last weekend. But yeah, the Fox Laserdisc did like the pseudo pan and scan thing where they just zoomed in a little bit on any of these 16:9 films. So basically you have shifting black bars at the top and bottom. So it's 2:35. You have the full thick bars if it's 16:9 or 1.85 more officially. Then they just zoom in to cut off the black bars. So that being said, if we try to fix that restoration, that reconstruction, basically, it's going to be tricky. It's not impossible.
Would you use, can seamless branching switch aspect ratio?
So I think that would be one option, but that would be, I just feel bad for Dave McKenzie on certain projects like Righting Wrongs. It's like, oh God, he's going to have PTSD from that. But I think we could do like one or the other and go like, oh, here's both options depending on how much disk space you have. But the tricky thing is with the master that they have, one of the weirder things on there is that, well, first of all, a lot of the films, for some reason, Fortune was using upscales for the footage. I don't know why. Same thing happened with Bruce Lee the Legend and Bruce Lee the Man the Legend, which I fixed, but we'll talk about that later on. But yeah, for some weird reason, a lot of the films in Fortune master of Best of the Martial Arts films were from upscales. Like, funny enough, if you watch the Righting Wrongs footage, not only is it cropped to 2.35, but it's upscaled. In the Righting Wrongs set, it's like, Fortune, you really didn't think something was weird about that? But the weirdest part is China O'Brien footage, because I had assumed for years that this was a film that was in like 1.85, 16:9, what have you, and like matted for that ratio. The footage on there, that's actually some of the real HD footage in there, and it's 235, and it doesn't look cropped, or at least not that cropped. Like, it looks like one of those ones that might have been shot like Super 35 where they could like format it later on. So it does look like a little bit's missing on the bottom, maybe the top, but you are seeing more on the sides as well. So it's like, was China O'Brien supposed to be 235? This is weird. I'm very confused.
Of when the documentary was made, because essentially they might have had access to very new elements at that point.
Maybe. So that's the other thing too. So I think it's going to be a lot of, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Like, I think the only footage in there that actually is still normal is the interview footage. Like, it's HD, it's 1.85. It's like, okay, this I can work with. But yeah, everything else I'm gonna have to go back to like Blu-rays of these films and then rip them carefully, make sure I don't compress them, and then put the footage in there. So I should probably just start preemptively doing this now. So maybe by the time like a year from now, you know, I was like, I'm ready. I can sleep. This is good. You know, one thing I probably should have been doing more when I was working on the Bruce Lee set, but yeah, sleep. What's sleep? It's fine. It's like you said about Frank Chang. He probably sleeps even less than I do. Like you said, he runs off of like what, 2.5 hours and like a pot of coffee.
That's incredible. I think I can, even with keeping a constant feel of coffee going, and I still feel like I'm chasing my own tail. We're going to touch a little bit on time management in general, just if we've got time again. But we've invoked his spirit, so we should properly speak about him. So. The Arrow Bruce Lee box set, which I think at the time that we were doing this will be arriving imminently. Be just a matter of weeks away. We've already mentioned earlier on, this is a UK exclusive for obvious reasons, because the American rights are still held by Criterion. But I think I did see an awful lot of. I've tried in my own small way to try and do a degree of re-education, because I think there was a huge amount of confusion initially in the forums about Enter the Dragon's listed on the box. Is it included in the set? Has anything been done to it? So I've made a couple of videos now on the channel just trying to explain, like, I think just count yourselves lucky that Warner's let Arrow include it at all.
Exactly.
I don't see it as a bad thing. It's a kind of straight port of the 40th anniversary Blu-ray release, which is cool. Arrow's got their own 50th anniversary release in the works. If people are super fussed about it, though, I do think they're kind of missing the point if they're just looking at this box set as an Into the Dragon box set, because it's called Bruce Lee at Golden Harvest for a reason.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly.
But I think that this is, to my knowledge, and you can please correct me if I'm wrong, this is probably the most heavily you've been involved in one single release thus far, in terms of the amount of work you've put in. You have, what, if I'm counting it right, individual commentaries for The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, and Way of the Dragon on your own, commentary with Mike Leader on Game of Death, a 3-hour video essay on Game of Death.
So that one's interesting. That one I would definitely say I assisted with, but that is definitely, like, so much of this. It's been flattering that people have been coming to me about this set, but at the same time, I'm like, I was only a fraction of this. Like, I cannot praise James Flower's work on this enough. Like, he was the mastermind, the leader, everything behind this. Like, so much of this set, you have to thank him for it. And so much of my work is basically just assisting with it. So he didn't completely, just lose his mind over everything like I probably would have. So because it's so funny, because when we were working on the set, like towards the end, like he was talking about us just like getting to the finish line, because it's like, we want to make sure we got everything right. And because we had like different ideas as to when this was initially going to come out, because there were already rumblings that it was going to be at the end of last year, but for a variety of reasons, it was for the best for it to be this year. One of which was the longer cut of The Big Boss, which that I was shocked. I mean, I was already shocked when the log footage from Game of Death was found. Like, it's funny because I first found out about that because he and I think we started talking last March. So it's been over a year since we started like communicating back and forth about the set. And I think it was like around March or April that he was like, hey, not only do we have film elements for the original 72 Game of Death footage, which was already a big deal because with Criterion, funny thing with Criterion was we were trying to see if Artport at the time still had anything for Bruce Lee and GOD, because at the very least, it would have been great just to have that in HD, because, all the Game of Death footage for the longest time outside of what was in the 78 film had just been standard def. Like any edits of the original footage, whether it's Warrior's Journey, Bruce Lee and GOD, even though Bruce Lee and GOD had a theatrical release, and obviously a film master at the time, because that was like 2001, I believe, 2001. So obviously it was going to be on film if it was in theaters. But the weird thing was Artport as we knew it didn't really exist anymore. So trying to get a straight answer about that was just going nowhere. So that was just not happening for the Criterion release. No HD version. So just getting film elements at all, let alone, it wasn't original camera negative, but it's essentially the second best, which is the interpositive. And I was like, oh my God, so we can actually get the Game of Death footage in HD. This is great. And then James like, oh, by the way, it's interpositives of all 11 reels, not just the 9. I'm like, wait, you mean with the log scene and the outdoor footage? He's like, yep. So, and the weirdest thing was that L'Imagine Ritrovata apparently just had those interpositives for a different source for Game of Death 78, just to kind of like research things. And they reached out to James, go like, hey, we have, the interpositives of this footage, with this be of any use. And he's like, oh God, yeah, let us see it. And then that's when he discovered that I had the 2 extra reels on there. And it was just like, this is nuts. And like, he sent me the footage to review it. And I was just flabbergasted. I was just sitting there like, how? Like, not only am I seeing this footage, but I'm seeing like multiple takes of this footage. I'm seeing outtakes of this footage. Like this, the funny thing is, I would say this is roughly on par with the Saw in the Head scene from The Big Boss. And of course, that one has still not been found. I'll get to that momentarily. But the log scene just seemed like it was just lost. Like I still remember the line from Warrior's Journey where the narrator blatantly says, the footage has been lost to the ravages of time. Yeah. And so we all kind of resigned ourselves to that for the last 20 years, going like, yeah, no, that's gone. And so when James told me that they had it and he sent it to me, I was just shocked. And so basically, he was allowing me access to the footage because one thing I was helping with, and this goes back to the video essay, was it Final Game of Death? For some reason I keep going back and forth between Final Game of Death and Last Game of Death. So it's like they both mean the same. It's like the final Rambo film was it Final Blood or Last Blood? No, it was Last Blood. But no, so for the video essay, there is a new edit of the footage. And so I was flattered that I was actually given the opportunity to be sort of like an assistant editor on there. And so because he made his initial edit, he sent that to me. And the great thing was he gave me like the files to work with plus the Premiere file, so I could kind of just like remotely edit and go like, hey, let's have the shot go a little longer. Let's have this one go a little shorter. Let's swap out this take here.
You're essentially getting his timeline that he's constructed.
Yeah. So, which I didn't even realize that was something that you just send and then just like, oh yeah, once you connect the files, it'll just all show up. And so it was like pseudo remote basically. And it was great just getting to go through and kind of like work off of the raw footage rather than, just take a pre-established edit like Warrior's Journey or Bruce Lee and G.O.D. and then try to create something from that. Like if you want a shot longer or shorter, you can do that because you actually have that shot there. And so it was just really surreal, like actually getting to help edit the raw footage, especially the log scene. I'm like, this is weird. Like this is very surreal. Like I still can't get over it. It was just very bizarre. But also just the fact that I love that James just kind of went, you know what, aside from the new edit, we're also just going to put all of it on there. Yeah. Like you will have all the footage. And I just sat there going, no one's done this before. Like Warrior's Journey, Bruce Lee and G.O.D., none of them. Like, no, you're just going to get our edit and then we're done.
You're basically just getting to sit down and watch his dailies, essentially. Yeah. You're seeing everything, warts and all.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is incredible.
And it's great to watch because there's also a lot of the frame flashes in between takes. Because a lot of people, when it was first announced that there was outdoor footage, everyone went, oh my God, we're going to see Bruce Lee fighting outdoors. I'm like, no. It's basically just more takes and full widescreen footage of the guards outside, including Wong In-sik, who of course didn't actually get to film his fight, but still filmed that portion. But regardless, there are a few quick moments in between takes where you do see Bruce outside giving a couple directions, but they're like very quick, like blink and you'll miss them literally. So that kind of counts. But even on set, like you can see shots where you can tell that Bruce wasn't going to be acting that day. Like he was just directing, James Tian and Che Yun, especially on the Dan and Santo floor. Like you see Bruce just wearing like regular clothing in between takes. It's really cool to see. But that's the other thing too. Like he and I and a third individual, I'm blanking on the name at the moment. I should have had more caffeine. We all kind of like took turns writing the narration for the full video essay, because you have the video essay that basically is all the footage with the narration over top, and then you also have the new edit. Which, by the way, there's also a new opening animated intro sequence that basically looks like if it were from 1972. And it's done by, once again, the name is eluding me. This one I do want to find, but
don't worry, I'll work it out and I can put it up at the top of the screen.
I think it's Gazelle Automations, if I'm not mistaken. They're the ones who did the fake Star Trek: The Next Generation animated footage. Okay. In which they basically wanted to make Star Trek: The Next Generation animated look like when the original series was animated. Yeah. And I remember that blew my mind. I thought that was amazing. So when I found out they reached out to them to do the animation for Game of Death and make it look like it was from 1972, I'm like, oh my God, this is going to be amazing. And I was not disappointed. It's just amazing the way they did the animations, even with fake blemishes, as if like there's a fingerprint that might have showed up while they're trying to like move Bruce Lee across the screen. Like you're watching, it's almost like watching the intro to The Big Boss. And Way of the Dragon. It has the same sort of animation to it. And a little bit of a spoiler alert, but they used the music from the theme to Bruce Lee the Legend for the music. Okay. So you're watching these animations, but you're hearing the Bruce Lee Legend theme while you're seeing Bruce Lee in the jumpsuit, doing the flying kick across the screen, and it gets you hyped up to watch the footage. Like, yeah, the music's familiar, but just seeing this animation together, knowing that you're about to see the footage, and you're like, oh my God, this is going to be amazing. Like when I first saw that, when he sent me that intro, it's like, this is, dude, I can't wait for everyone else to see this. And now, on that note, the past week or so, I've been seeing so many people saying that they've been seeing the Mandarin cut of The Big Boss now.
Yeah, because it's showing it at UK cinemas pretty much all of and going into next month. We see Fist of Fury in 2 days.
Nice.
We're going to have to travel city for it, but well worth
it. But yeah, no, with the Mandarin cut, I first got wind of that last year. It's a couple months later. It was funny because it was actually my mother's birthday. I got an email from James saying, so by the way, we got the longer cut of The Big Boss. I'm just sitting there like, what? I'm like, sir, I don't believe you. And he sent me just like one screen cap with, watermark over top for obvious reasons. And I just sat there like, that's not fake. That's not AI. That's not Photoshop. That's an actual screen cap with a burnt in subtitle at the bottom. And it was funny. And I think James actually talked about this at one of the screenings because someone actually recorded his intro.
Yeah, I saw it. Great.
He was talking about how like everyone assumed that was like this big, great Indiana Jones like, excursion to find this footage. And it was more like, hey, do you have this film reel there? Oh yeah, no, we do.
Yeah, this one.
Exactly. And like more specifically what Fortune Star had, they had a digibeta, like a standard def digibeta to begin with, which in and of itself was shocking that they even had that. So I was like, I'll take it. It's whatever. And then that's when James went, okay, let me see if by some chance Fortune Star can reach out to the Hong Kong Film Archive and see if they actually have the reels used to make that digibeta years ago. And it's like, well, if not, at least we have a standard definition version. We have something, because I've joked with people who might have like complained about things here and there. Like I saw one person online go, it's like, oh, don't tell me the burnt in subtitles are over all the footage. I'm just sitting there thinking, what did you think was going to happen? Like getting a theatrical print at all was going to be a miracle. Of course, it was going to have burnt in subs. And they kind of backpedaled after that. They're like, I'm sorry. It's like, it's fine. I'm just stressed. Because I joked at the same time that so many of these fans, including myself, probably would have spent like $1,000 for a 5th generation VHS, cropped to 4:3 VHS, blurry subtitle cut off on the sides version years ago, let alone getting an actual widescreen version. Still standard def. But, yeah, but that was the thing though. So it's like, okay, it's standard def, but it's something. It's fine. So then when James told me that they found the film reels, we're going to get them scanned, I was like, this is amazing. Because, realistically speaking, I don't know if we'll ever actually find like the pre-subtitled elements, like an inner negative, inner positive, certainly the original camera negative outside of what's been conformed to the final cut, which he also talked a bit about how like the Cantonese cut, basically that is the last version that the negatives were conformed to. And so that's where the negatives live, the finished negatives. But the rest of the negatives that weren't used and, the ones that were used and then cut out, that could be, who knows where that is. And the funny thing is, I actually, in my video essay, which was funny because he and I were talking about, like, what if we did a video essay talking about the scenes that are still missing? Because the one that we all predicted would still be missing, and we were correct, was the saw in the head scene. I for years told myself, if we ever find a longer cut of the Big Balls, do not expect that. Like, and if by some very slim chance it would show up, cool, added bonus. But I knew going in that probably wasn't going to be a thing, and I was right. But I was kind of surprised at some of the other things that were still missing. So he and I were talking. It's like, why don't I do a video essay that actually like organizes what's still missing or what was most likely filmed, but we only have so much evidence here and there. Like, for example, one bit, I want to say it's like day 2 in the film when Chow Mei is looking off at the sunrise as, Chang and the uncle go to his first day at work. You can hear footsteps in the distance. Like, you actually can hear Chang and third uncle leaving, but you never see them. And she's holding a tray with empty glasses on it. And it's like, that's weird. But then, of course, there's a photo showing the 3 of them standing out front with her holding that tray with the glasses. And the fact that they even did the sound effects of footsteps in the distance, you're like, okay, so they probably did something in post. They must have filmed something. Why else would they have those sound effects there? Because it just seems kind of pointless. It's a little weird. So basically the video essay is me sleuthing like what might have been filmed, what could have been filmed, based on, photos and sound effects and things like that. And it's just interesting because there is that combination of like what was cut for censorship, what was cut for time, and then what had to be cut again for time later on. Because the thing is, with the 100-minute version, 99-minute version, what have you, like the final cut, and you compare it with the Mandarin cut, which is 110 minutes, you will notice that there are moments that are like not even a second long that were cut, just because they were so desperate to get it even shorter. Because I think what happened was, with the very first cut they had, which is probably closer to like 115 minutes, I'm taking a guess here, it was probably a combination of censors and cinema operators who were like, hey, you need to cut this thing out for violence or sexual content. You need to cut this down so we can get more showtimes per day. But then, of course, they didn't expect how big the big bus was actually going to be. So then once it blew up and they're having all these sold out shows, they're like, hey, can you make it shorter? And then it got down to about 100 minutes at that point. And the one example I bring up is Drunken Master. Because I think a lot of people forget that Drunken Master kind of went through the same thing. And that's part of the reason why so many, especially US releases, some UK, but a lot of the US releases, if they had a Cantonese track, they were incomplete. Because luckily, by this point, by the late 70s, exporting these titles was becoming more popular. So luckily, the full 110-minute version of Drunken Master actually got out of Hong Kong, which is why the English dubs were always complete. But then the Cantonese version started getting cut down. The irony is, but the irony is finding that actual cut version of Drunken Master is harder to find than the actual trimmed down Cantonese audio. And I think I've only ever seen it on one videotape. I forgot what company put it out. It was like a public domain release. It was from it was Made-to-See or somebody else. It was a very low budget VHS version of Drunken Master that was cut down. And so when I first saw that version, after I had seen the Sony DVD, which had the cut Cantonese audio, it suddenly clicked on my head like, oh, that's what happened. They only had access to a shorter version of Drunken Master for the audio at the time. But the funny thing is, since then, of course, Eureka put out the uncut audio on disc. But then Twilight Time did a US Blu-ray that was a double feature with Snake and Equal Shadow, and it still had the cut Cantonese after the Eureka Blu-ray. I'm like, how, guys? Like, how's that even a thing? You've had 20 years to fix this, or almost 20 years at the time, because I think it was like 2000, 2002 when the Sony DVD came out. But yeah, with Big Boss, that's basically what happened. There's just like cinema operators like, hey, this is doing really well. We want to see if we can squeeze in one more showtime per day. Can you get another 10 minutes out? So yeah, there are moments of like dialogue that get like cut off by like 12 frames in comparison to the other version. Like they really were trying to get to a very specific runtime, like get it under 100 basically. And yeah, that's the thing, like film preservation, especially for those movies, because people forget this was before the VHS era. Like these films were put out in theaters, made their money, and then they were done. Maybe a re-release down the line, and then that was it. So they never thought anything about these, especially because, like I said, at the time, exporting these films wasn't really a big priority. And that's why, like, even some of the earlier Shaw Brothers films, some of those don't have English dubs because they weren't really prepared for that. Like, there's one off the top of my head, I can't remember which one it was. It was one of the 60s era films that there was just no older English dub. Like, I think at least one of them, they tried to do a newer English dub just because there was no English track. But yeah, it wasn't until the Hong Kong films were becoming popular, they're like, hey, we might have an audience outside of Hong Kong. Let's start releasing them. Even though, of course, there was the stories that apparently Bruce Lee was not happy about his earlier films getting released outside. It's like, no, I can do better than this. I don't want, Americans seeing my work, even though people forget that it was the Big Boss that got him Enter the Dragon, because that was a film that Fred Weintraub saw where he's like, hey, we should probably work with this guy. So I think Bruce Lee, despite everyone saying how much of an ego he had, I think at the same time, he was also his own worst critic. So, and I kind of respect that because I'm the same way. But no, it's like even with Way of the Dragon, when he found out that, the export rights were up for grabs, he kind of panicked. Even though he had control over that film, he knew what worked for the Hong Kong audiences. And there were rumors that, like there were rumors that he wanted to redo Way of the Dragon for Western sensibilities down the road. So he didn't want people to see that one, which also would have eliminated the chance for him to do his own interpretation outside. And it's funny because you don't often get to see directors remake their own films for different audiences. Like I'll probably think of an example later on, but I think that there's been some European directors who've kind of gone through that. A few Asian directors have gone through that.
Ringu. So I think Ringu was kind of like kind of originally made in Japan, and then the same director just basically Americanized it slightly. But just because it flashed into my head quickly, to the person that was kind of bemoaning the burnt-in subtitles, in some ways, part of the reason that we're lucky to have some of the elements that we have for some of these movies was a weird side effect of Britain being in control of Hong Kong up to 97. So I think legally they had to put in English subtitles, certainly for most of the films. I think some of the Shaw Brothers stuff circumnavigated that towards the end of the 60s. I think if it was something that was seen as not having that much of a outside interest So they're not expecting the Westerners in Hong Kong to want to go see certain wuxia movies or certain kind of like romantic sort of some of the other types of movies that Shaw Brothers were making. But so there are definitely kind of weird exceptions. But yeah, it was a curious time, like this weird perfect storm of strange disparate elements that's allowed us, thankfully, to still be able to have any of these things to pull back from. Because, like you say, Hong Kong not known for its not known for its cinematic preservation.
Yeah, at least not at the time. I mean, they've definitely made some strides, especially with the Hong Kong branch of the Majin Richavada, which in and of itself has always been sort of a double-edged sword to me, that company, because I've seen people online, whenever you mention Le Majin Richavada, there is cringing, mainly because of color grading.
Okay.
And it's always been a bit of a double-edged sword for me, because I think they do amazing cleanup work and scanning work. But yeah, the thing is, it's not even the Asian branch, because I think it's Le Majin Richavada Asia, even though they're based in Hong Kong. I think they call it Asia. It's allegedly the branch in Italy that does the color grading. Like, basically, the Asian branch will do the scanning and get everything ready and like the physical cleanup. I think they do some of the digital cleanup as well. I could be mistaken. And then they send the files over to Italy, the main branch, and then that's where the color grading happens. And I found out recently that apparently part of the reason why so many of their color grades have sort of like that teal amber thing going on is because apparently one of the lead colorists says, oh, well, that's how, the film stock when these films were, printed for the actual release would have had the film look. So I'm sitting there thinking, so you're basically basing the colors on a release print rather than what the directors probably wanted? I don't know how I feel about that. Now, to be fair, with the Bruce Lee films, we got lucky because for the Era release, they were actually able to get access to the scans from Richavada before any work was done. So
amazing. Yeah.
I don't know who did
files,
I don't know who did the actual restoration work for this one, because the verbiage still makes it seem like it's still Richavada, but I think Arrow had more of a say on the color grades this time, if I'm not mistaken. Because I know there's a few different companies they worked with. They worked with, I think, Restore, which is like R3 Store, and then there's the same company that did the Eureka 4K restoration of Super Cop. But I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head. I think it's like the Salt House or something like that. I can't remember. It sounds like a pub, but I might have mixed it up with something else. But that's the thing. Like, they made sure that these color grades were custom made for the Era release, which is why they all look brand new. Like, the Big Boss basically looks like it was shot yesterday. Like, I can't imagine the film looking much better than it does now. And that's the thing. Like, I think when you have like more control over your color grades, like a color grading alone can make your movie look older by accident. And the irony is that I've seen times where they try to use a modern color grade on an older film, and the weird thing is it cancels out and makes it look older. I can't put my finger on why. It's like this weird psychological thing where it's like, oh, we'll do the teal amber thing like some of these modern movies, and you made your movie look older. Like, how do you do that?
I know the one that I hear the most kickback about is certainly there was a kind of an era. It's not so much for those the movies that were coming out in the 70s, but once you kind of got into the tail end of the 80s, when there was that slightly more kind of stylized cinematography, they would use a kind of blue cast or an off-color temperature style.
Exactly.
So they would just kind of not balance it. Or Wong Kar-wai, I think, a little bit more famous for how he's used fluorescent lights and incandescent lights. So but even he's kind of gone back and tinkered a little bit with that. But certainly some of the color corrections, they would literally just, that's coming back, bounce blue or bounce too blue. So they would just neutralize it back to kind of like more natural skin tones, and a legion of people would tear their hair out, right? So I think certainly I've seen it more for that, but I think it gets into more, I always think for the 70s movies, it gets more to sort of a degree of personal taste and preference, where sometimes people will see one version that looks ever so slightly warmer for sake of argument, or ever so slightly cooler or pinky bluer. And it's kind of, I think kind of both sometimes have their merits, but it's nice to kind of be able to kind of go back to a more accurate representation of how it was on the negative, because that's your clearest indicator of how they wanted to do it. If you can kind of go back to the interpositive.
Well, even that gets a little tricky at times too, because sometimes release prints can work, to an extent, but at the same time, I think it's because you don't want to put too much, no pun intended, too much stock in the film stock, because I think that's where the issue lies. So sometimes when restorations are done, they look at different release prints just to see if there's like a common thread. Because the other thing is, when you're working with the original camera negative, there are also times where you're working with pre-graded materials, because there can be times where a director wanted a specific look in post, because, you know, with film at the time, you know, everything had to be thrown in through the color lab, tell them, hey, you know, ramp up the, you know, the blues, reds, the greens, you know, for this shot, for this footage here. And so it can be tricky, like trying to differentiate between like, what do you think the director wanted versus the release prints? Because release prints, you have a variety of issues. Like, because sometimes you can get good colors, but then sometimes, like I said, with the Richard Vada scenario, when he mentioned that, like, oh yeah, this specific film stock caused this, you know, yellowish tinge, so we're recreating that. It's like, but that wasn't the director's intention. But, you know, some release prints don't have that issue. So I'm kind of backpedaling a little bit on what I said earlier. It's like, oh, you're using a release print, how dare you? But at the same time, sometimes they can help. But if you know that that specific film stock adds color of a different sort than what the director intended, then you should know to not do that. I think that's my biggest issue. But yeah, so with original camera negatives, it can be tricky. With some films, it is just a matter of like kind of neutralizing it, and, you know, making sure that your black levels aren't milky, your white levels aren't blown out, if you can like tone it down a little bit. So it's a major juggling act.
It's a minefield, and different for every single film. This is a complete tangent, but again, it just popped into my head. We recently got a chance to see David Fincher's Seven and 35mm, which I'd never seen kind of projected cinematically. I'd only ever known it on physical media, and that was one of the first films to kind of really use or champion the use of bleach bypass, kind of going through when it was obviously shot photochemically. And I think he had got to huge levels of frustration by the fact that they were skipping that when they were doing the bulk replication for most of the negatives that were going out to the cinema. So essentially it was easier and cheaper for them to just essentially kind of try and do an approximation in grade, and so it made the film look radically different. But I think we saw one of the actual properly corrected bleach bypass prints, and it looked like a completely different movie. I mean, the blacks were pitch black to a point where I think he said he wanted the blacks that were in screen to just merge with the black bars around the edge of the screen, but still actually have some sort of definition in the shadows, and that was pretty cool.
And that's very tricky too, because there's always that aspect that they call black crush, and it's, unless you know for sure that that's the director's intention, that will automatically get everyone's, you know, ire. But that's the thing too, like I said, you don't want something that looks, you know, flat contrast, but you also don't want something that's so overly contrasty that you do have the crushed blacks, you do have the blown out whites, and it's not fun for anyone at that point. And it's like, you know, going back to what we were saying about photography and how, you know, if you shoot RAW versus JPEG, like, oh, this shot's a little overexposed, I can tone it down. Oh, this one was a little underexposed, I can kind of get some of the shadow elements back out. And with films, sometimes you can do that, sometimes you can't. Depends on what you're working with. And that's the other thing too, that I think, because I think James also mentioned this in his opening presentation, how, you know, you have different sources, and like the very rudimentary version I tell people is that the hierarchy basically is, you know, original camera negative, inner positive, inner negative, and then release print. And so the fact that the Big Boss release print that they had access to still had decent shadow detail, like not perfect, but still for like essentially a 50-year-old film print that still had decent shadow detail that like wasn't fading out or anything like that, was kind of a minor miracle. Like, it actually looked really good. Because a lot of release prints, sometimes that's the biggest hurdle, is that the shadows are just crushed. So, or even the white levels start to blow out. Like, the funny thing is, I feel like a lot of the Hong Kong films I've seen theatrical prints of on like digital form are from the Japanese releases of the Jackie Chan films, because a lot of them use the Japanese theatrical scans as a bonus. And you can see like some do have that, you know, decent contrast, while others like, oh yeah, no, this is definitely more of an older print that definitely has like a more contrasty look. It might have even been like a print of a print, for all we know, because that can be a thing as well. You know, typically you don't want to do that, but you know, stranger things have happened.
I think it happened a lot. Particularly unofficially. Let me remove that thing. I think it happened an awful lot with people kind of trying to basically make a little profit on the side. It was a little bit of a side,
or like 35 to 16 on top of that. So but yeah, so for the Bruce Lee set, some of the other things real quick, just so I'm not, you know, rambling too much.
No, it's great.
But yeah, no, doing the commentaries for those was another case of fun but stressful. Just to put it out there, because James and I talked about this last year, like if I was going to do commentaries for this one, I was like, oh yeah, if you want to use the Big Boss commentary, you can. And he's like, well, it's a really good commentary, but can you do a new one? I'm like, can I? And the funny thing was like, oh, I don't know if I can, do more, do better. Then I went back and listened to it again. It's like, oh no, I can do better. Because like I said, I just recorded that in like my home office in my townhouse with no sound dampening at all, just using a little lavalier mic. And since then I have like an actual like portable vocal booth that I use now with a professional microphone hooked up directly to my computer with a little mixer and everything. It sounds a lot better than what I had before. And unlike last time where I did like a bullet point thing, I basically did what I've been doing in recent years and doing more of like a script where it's like 35, 40 pages of just notes upon notes upon notes that I just am trying to read. And I'll leave it up to the fans, but I do think this one is better than the previous. In fact, there are some things I realized I was mistaken about in the previous commentary that I'm like, all right, I know what I'm wrong, so let me try to fix this. So there's a couple things that I kind of call out there. Fist of Fury and Way of the Dragon, because of more of a time strain at that point, I did kind of do the bullet point trick with that one to get through that commentary. But I'm still pretty happy with how they turned out. And I joke with people that like, well, if you don't like my commentaries on those, then you can listen to the other options you have on there. Because I know it was Way of the Dragon that has Frank Jang and Michael Worth as well. So it's like, well, if you don't like my solo commentary on Way of the Dragon, listen to them instead. I will not be offended. You're fine. But yeah, with Game of Death, I talked to James about that. He's like, oh yeah, if you want to have Mike leader on that one, you can. I'm like, oh, cool. And the only stipulation we had, and this made perfect sense, was try to focus more on the 78 production. Because obviously with, Final Game of Death, that's going to cover all the bases of the 72 production. So it's like, okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Why ramble about the 72 version? Well, we should be talking about the 78 version. So Mike and I, thankfully, like we grazed the 72 footage because, you still had to a little bit, especially when you get to the actual footage, but we didn't like deep dive into it. We saved that for the video essay. But yeah, so we were talking a lot about, the 78 version, the kind of like pseudo theorized power struggle with, Robert Klaus and Sammo Hung. And, who you could tell like who directed what. And yeah, so that kind of took a bit of a load off of me by having, Mike swoop in to help with that one. But yeah, no, I did not expect that I would actually pull off as many commentaries as I did for this set. But yeah, what else did I actually do in this set aside from, assistant editing the Game of Death footage, the 4 commentaries, 3 solo, and then the one with Mike, the 2 video essays, not quite Biggest Boss, and then So funny enough, the Fist of Fury one, the Fist of Fury sequels one that I did, I called it New Fist Part 2 Fist because I was thinking of like one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. And at first I was going to like make it really long, like New Fist, Chan Fist, Part 2 Fist, Bruce Lee Fist or something like that. It's like, that is way too much. New Fist Part 2 Fist. Screw it. That's the name. But you'll notice like when you actually see the logo, what I did was in the background, I have the Jingwuman title, the original Fist of Fury title, but as it's turning, you'll actually see the Chinese character for new and the Chinese character for sequel appear on each side because the Mandarin title for Fist of Fury Part 2 was, I think it was a Jingwuman Shiji, which basically literally means Fist of Fury sequel, or, sequel to the Gate of Jingwu. And then, New Fist of Fury is literally Xin Jingwuman, New Fist of Fury. So this is basically New Fist of Fury sequel in the background. So I guess that's sort of like the unofficial Chinese title of my video essay, but it was meant to be sort of a nod to referencing both films at once. That was a very like 11th hour project I did. I didn't even think I would get it on there, but James like, oh no, we have enough time to finish that one. So if you want, you can finish that. We'll put it on the Bruce Lee set, and then we also put it on the New Fist of Fury release in the US. But yeah, so the other thing I did, I almost forgot about this, even though I referenced it earlier when we were talking about best of the martial arts films and trying to do some reconstructing when there's like upscale footage. I did mention this earlier, but when we got the files for the documentaries, Bruce Lee the Legend and Bruce Lee the Man the Legend, for some bizarre reason, the footage for Big Boss, Fist of Fury, Enter the Dragon, and the 78 footage of Game of Death were all from an upscale. I don't know why, because the weirdest thing with the Bruce Lee footage is there's been like so many different restorations over the years that it's kind of mind-numbing. So much so, going back to when I worked with Shout in 2013, or going into their 2013 release, the biggest hurdle there was, in fact, they had to recall the set, was that they didn't realize that they were given upscales, even though the Cam and Ronson Blu-rays were already in HD. And I basically had to explain to Cliffs, like, guys, you can't put this out. These are upscales. Like, what's going on here? It's like, oh, they shouldn't be upscales. And what I did was I basically screen capped the Cam and Ronson Blu-ray and did like a 200 or 300% blow up on Bruce's eye, like right before the final fight, and compared it with the upscaled version. And that's when they, you know, the light bulb went off for like, yeah, we need to fix this. But like the upscale should have been long gone by this point, because, you know, you had those HD masters from like around 2010 that Cam and Ronson had. You had the previous 4K restorations. You have the new 4K restorations. So why Fortstar was still having access to these upscaled versions of the, you know, HD masters was beyond me. So it's like, all right, well, I need to fix those. So in both Bruce Lee
selecting the wrong file from a,
I wonder, like, I wouldn't be surprised if it was something as simple as that would just cause that big of an issue. So yeah, with both Bruce Lee, the Man, the Legend, and the Legend, I had to go through and find like every bit that the footage was used, take them out, and then use the new restorations and put them in. And on top of that, the other weird thing that they did, especially in Bruce Lee, the Man, the Legend, was for any time that they had the moments where they were showing like photographs, where in the original documentary, you could tell that they just had a camera on a picture and then they would just zoom in and then just leave it there. They would restore like one frame from these photos and then like digitally zoom in, and then it would just be static. It would just look jarring. It would look very digital. So I had to go through and basically try to make it resemble how it was before, where it looked more like a natural zoom, because when you digitally zoom and there's no blur, it just looks very weird. It's like, ugh. So I had to go through and recreate the analog zoom. I had to recreate sort of the analog telesign wobble. I think that's how you say it. I feel like I always say the word wrong. Telesign, telecine, the thing where the film's going through the reel. And I call myself a film expert. But yeah, so trying to create like a very subtle wobble, like just enough. It's not like, but it's more like, oh yeah, no, there's movement. So like Bruce Lee, the Man Legend was just like they both had more of an issue than the other. Like I said, Bruce Lee, the Legend, uses a lot more of the finished film footage, and Bruce Lee, the Man Legend, uses a lot of the static photos. So both of them had their pros and cons to work with. Oh yeah. And the funny thing on top of that was, anytime I would put in the restored footage, properly restored footage for the Bruce Lee films in Bruce Lee, the Legend, I also had to replicate the on-screen text. So basically, I had to extract that from the other version of the restoration, then just plop it back in. So I was trying to use sort of a masking effect. So because of that, in most instances, I was also able to kind of replicate the natural shake of the text on there too. So rather than, because the Hong Kong Legends version, if you watch that version of Bruce Lee Legend, you can tell that while they were able to extract the text, they just plopped it in and just had it sit there. So, which is fine, but it doesn't feel nearly as filmic. Yeah. So, but
literally, most of those were made at a time when somebody would have been actually kind of hand placing down the text over the top and kind of going through like probably through a negative stacker. So their text would be on one negative, and then the film would another, and then you kind of align the two. Yeah,
exactly. So those were a big undertaking. I'm hoping people like the end results of both of them. And I think the last thing I did, off the top of my head, I'm probably still missing something because it was a lot, was a very specific version of Tower of Death. So if I'm not mistaken, I want to say at the end of the day, there's like 4 versions of Tower of Death in the set, because it's finally in HD for starters, because my God, like even Criterion was tricked into putting an upscale on there because there just was no HD master, like a true HD master of Tower of Death. You know, because they just made the one master back in like 2003 and then called it a day. Because you'll notice, like, if you look at the outline for the Criterion set, you know, with the other films, even Enter the Dragon, they all said like, you know, new 4K restoration, new 2K restoration. And then you look at Tower of Death, which says, you know, Game of Death 2, it says, oh, a 1080p HD master. When I first read that, even though I was helping Criterion, I'm sitting there going, why do I feel like this is going to be the old upscale that was on the Japanese Blu-ray? And it was, and it was still just Game of Death 2. No Tower of Death option, no Cantonese. Like that's been the weirdest thing about that film, is that Fortstar has prioritized that film in English for years. To be fair, even though it is a Hong Kong film and Cantonese is like the official language for the film, your main actors, Kim Dae-jung, Hwang Jing-lee, they're most likely speaking Korean anyway. So it's like splitting hairs, but the official language should be Cantonese for the film. So the fact that Star had only prioritized English all this time was weird. So we made sure to
I think
fix
they
that
just went where the sales were. I honestly, cause I think outside of Hong Kong, I think that film was much, much more popular and of much more interest to kind of Western audiences than it was in Hong Kong for the last little while. I hope that situation changes a little bit. There's a sort of new generation of people kind of coming up now who are a little bit more keen to dive back into kind of Hong Kong cinematic history based in Hong Kong. But yeah, I think for the longest time, I think the only place they could sell it was to the likes of the Hong Kong Legends and to these sort of places.
True. And that was the funny thing too, because it slowly dawned on me. It's like, I think the last official release of the Hong Kong cut was the Hong Kong Legends DVD. Yeah. So it's like, has it really been like 20 plus years? Like what the hell? How have we not fixed this? Yeah. So with this, we made sure, and it's funny because, little side note, some people were complaining that it's in the set. It's like, that's not really a Bruce Lee movie. It's like, it's got Bruce Lee footage in it that's nowhere else. Shut up. Yeah. Like, I know that's blunt, but my God, like, there's multiple bits of, deleted or alternate Enter the Dragon footage. Like, even the monk footage in Tower of Death is not the same take that's in Enter the Dragon. Yeah. It's most noticeable when he does it hits all by itself, because in Enter the Dragon, it's more like a slow raise, while in Tower of Death is like it hits all by itself. Like he just brings the fist up really fast. So it's even a different take. People don't realize that. But yeah, you have the scene with him going into his room on Han's Island. You have the extra footage of him talking to Mei Ling. So Tower of Death has Bruce Lee footage that's nowhere else. So it's like, why sneeze at that? And, as cheesy as the film overall is, it's got some great fights from the Yun Clan. So come on, guys, And, as with any of the films in the set, we want to make sure we can have the best possible presentations. But with Tower of Death, there was like 4 different versions. So the funny thing is, well, we do have the Hong Kong cut. We have the Korean cut, which I know a lot of people are going to be excited for, because it's such a different movie. Like, I can't express it enough. It's the shortest version. It's only like a scant 75 minutes, I think. But because of the way it's edited and how they didn't go through reshoots yet, like Kim Dae-jung literally plays just one character. He's not brothers in this movie. Like, that's how different it is between the 2 versions. And then we have, of course, the export cut that's been available from Star for the last 20 years. But there was a 4th one, and that was what I have jokingly called for years the non-Enter the Dragon export cut, where basically all the Enter the Dragon footage, save for literally one shot, aside from like a freeze frame, but like one shot of Bruce sitting down, all of the Enter the Dragon footage have been replaced with footage from Big Boss, Way of the Dragon, I think Fist of Fury as well. But the thing is, I had to go through and replicate that. So it was a tricky thing where, kind of going back to that argument about whether or not you should use, film prints as a master for color, I went back to an old US VHS release of Game of Death 2, which is pretty hard to find. It was from Cinema Group Video, which put out a few Golden Harvest titles in the 80s. And so that was one of the few sources for that non-Enter the Dragon version of the film. And I was trying to replicate like how tight some of the shots should have been, because, for example, at the end of Hwang Jing-lee's opening fight scene, rather than cutting to Bruce from Enter the Dragon footage saying, "Excuse me, it's Lau's time," of course, dubbed over saying, "Challenges everywhere, everyone wants to be number one." Instead of the Enter the Dragon footage, is a shot of Bruce from the Big Boss right before he's telling the final henchman in the finale, "Just keep away, go on, it's not your fight." But I was trying to figure out like the framing on it, because obviously they optically zoomed in just enough to kind of like cut off the white shirt. So I'm like, all right, so that was in 4:3 though, and overcompensating the panning and scanning. So it probably shouldn't be cropped that tightly. So I probably need to pull out just a little bit. And so you're trying to like, you're basically doing math, because you're comparing the panning and scanning of the surrounding scenes and how they look in the restored widescreen version. And so you're just like, okay, this might be close enough. And then someone's going to come out of the woodwork with like a 35mm reel of that version of the film going, "No, you got the formatting wrong." Boom, fix it. That's always the thing. But on top of that, and James and I talked about this, because there's moments where there's flashbacks, because if you've seen either version of the export release of Tower of Death, there's flashbacks that do like this Wayne's World watery type thing. And the thing that kind of made me stop in my tracks was, how do I replicate that? Because I don't have a template watery transition that I can use. So I had to do some research with Adobe After Effects. to try to recreate the watery flashback transition that they used in Tower of Death or Game of Death 2 specifically. And trying to match like the right number of frames that it was transitioning. And also, I was trying to make the footage look a little more warm because I was also using the new era restorations of the Big Boss and Way the Dragon and all those. And I didn't want them to look too good.
Yeah.
Because that was the other problem too.
Jarring, potentially jarring. Because it kind of...
Yeah, because especially since so many of these shots were being zoomed in, you know that they were being like optically transferred over, so they were going to be degraded. So it's like, how do I make this look just degraded enough that it's still like restored-ish, but still has some, you know, like colors are off a little bit of debris here and there. It's like, So hopefully when people watch that version, you know, the non-Enter the Dragon version, it'll seem seamless enough that they'll enjoy, because a lot of people haven't seen that version. Like, it's mainly just through YouTube clips that people have actually seen that. But it even has like the really long end credit sequence too, where, you know, they show each actor on screen with their own names. And that, I think that whole end credit sequence is like, I feel like it's like 5 or 6 minutes long, which for a Hong Kong film, export or not, that was a long time for the early 80s.
Normally you get one frame, guys.
Yeah, exactly. And well, the thing with Tower of Death is that the export version, I'll be blunt, it's basically just fluff and padding, because the Hong Kong cut, I think at film speed is like 86 minutes, which isn't bad. It's better than the Korean version at, you know, 75 minutes. But for the export version, they're like, oh no, we need to beef this up. So that's when they took the greenhouse fight from the Hong Kong version of Game of Death, because like, hey, you know, international audience haven't seen this fight, we'll put it in there. And to be fair, that's how I first saw that fight as well, because I saw Game of Death 2, you know, the dub export version, well before I ever saw the Hong Kong cut of Game of Death. So I didn't even know. Yeah, I didn't even know that fight was originally shot for the Hong Kong release and the, you know, general Asian territories of Game of Death. So you had that. You had the flashback to the childhood footage of Bruce Lee movies, which is so funny because in the official export version of Game of Death 2, the one with the Enter the Dragon footage, they don't even say Billy Lowe at age such and such. They say Bruce Lee at age 8, at age 16. I'm like, are you telling that to the audience, or it's like we already know it's a flashback? This is weird. You're kind of breaking the fourth wall here, guys. So that was jarring as hell. And then you had the Bruce Lee funeral footage, which was not as bad as what Game of Death did, but still a little off. And then, of course, you know, 2 different versions of the end credits, because they just wanted to beef this out. And, you know, the whole reason the movie even exists is because of international sales. Because, like, oh, no, we're going to do a Game of Death 2. And then, you know, I think it was Toa in Japan who bought the rights to it before they even filmed anything. And then that's when they found that they had, like, no real extra Game of Death footage at the time that they had access to. So they're like, what do we do now? Oh, we have access to Enter the Dragon footage. Screw it. We're going to make Billy Lowe look more like Lee in Enter the Dragon. Even though, to be fair, obviously, Tower of Death was not meant to be a Game of Death sequel. I think they just kept the Game of Death 2 name because of that pre-sale thing. Mm-hmm. But then in Hong Kong, they decided to make it its own film, Tower of Death, because he's not called, you know, Billy Lowe or Lo Bele in the Cantonese version. He's, I think it's Lee Chen Kung. I think that's his Cantonese name. Because Lee Chen Kuo is the younger brother that, you know, Kim Tai-jong is playing, and they're not hiding his face anymore. Mm-hmm. But that's the funny thing is, by the way, if you watch... This will be my last Tower of Death thing, then we'll move on. But if you watch the English dub, the Game of Death 2 version, there's one moment where they accidentally use the original name instead of Billy Lowe. It's when Billy Lowe meets Ku's, Huang Jingli's daughter in the nightclub. He doesn't refer to himself as Billy Lowe. He says, no, I'm not. I'm Li Chen Chang. It's like, really? Are you sure you're not Billy Lowe in this version of the movie? So yeah, that's literally one moment in the dub where they use the original Chinese name. It's a little more, you know, westernized, like Li Chen Chang instead of Li Chen Kung. But yeah, that's basically the Cantonese name that snuck into the English dub.
That's kind of weird.
It's very weird.
And it's because it's the same voice actor. It's not like it's dropping into a different dub.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Barry Hai doing the voice as well, who did Tang Long in Way of the Dragon. But yeah, so I don't know if when they were just translating everything over, like it's slipped through. It's like that one episode of the US version of The Office where they're trying to swap out Dwight's name and something, but there was a Dwight, so it didn't swap out his name properly, and he got offended. So I wonder if it's just sort of a similar thing where it's like, all right, so every time it says Li Chan Kyung, it needs to be Billy Lowe, and then they just missed one, and no one caught it while they were dubbing. Because, you know, when they dubbed those movies, they were just like churning them out. I think it was Michael Kay in his interview for Fist of Fury when he said like, yeah, we would spend like maybe one like 8 to 12 hour session going through a movie and then just off to the next one. So they could do like multiple films in 1 week. So they probably just didn't catch it till after the fact. And you know,
it was wild.
Nerds like me catching it decades later. You know, all these movies came out before I was even born. So like, who's this jackass born in 85 making fun of the way we dubbed this movie? But no, it's a lot of fun. Like, it's one of those things where you watch these movies over and over and over again, and then you see something you didn't see before, hear something you didn't notice before, and you know, that's a lot of replayability watching these films. So
absolutely, and yeah. I think really, I mean, everything that you've just gone through, I hope people take away as a testament to the insane level of passion, commitment, and sheer bloody hard work that's gone into this, especially really because I think. I've seen so much grumbling that I'm astounded by. I think kind of people have reached a level of entitlement. And I think I don't want to just rag on people because people don't have to buy something if they don't want to, but it's a really big deal, I think, and I hope people recognize how big, how definitive a set this is going to be. I can't imagine anybody topping this.
No, really, I mean, because it's one of those things where it's like, and I've said the same thing too. It's like, I can't imagine this being top. Like at this point, the only things I could even think of that would even top it would be if some miracle they find the rest of the missing Big Boss footage, which I even allude to in my video essay. It's like, could it be found? Who knows? You know, it's one of those things where it's like, you don't know. It's like the Metropolis footage took 80 years to find. It took us, you know, I would say 50 years to find the Big Boss footage, but more like 40 plus because of the 79 London showing. But yeah, like you never know. Like it's one of those things where it's like you can find like an inner negative hiding somewhere, or it's like even something on the other end of the spectrum, you know, one of those so bad it's good movies, Miami Connection. It's like, oh, well, you know, we found an old film print. That's the best we can do for this Blu-ray. And then a decade later, you know, in the meantime, it's like, oh, well, the negatives were lost, but then Vinegar Syndrome goes out and goes, oh, well, we found the inner positive. So we're going to put this on 4K now. So, like, that's the thing. You don't know. It's like the film elements can be found anywhere when you least expect it. But for the time being, this really does feel like the end-all, be-all Bruce Lee set. I know I'm a little biased, but at the same time, like, I've worked on multiple Bruce Lee sets. So, you know, it's like Criterion did a great job at the time. But, yeah, no, I mean, once again, I cannot overstate the work that James at Arrow put into this. And, you know, all the titles that we worked on. But, like, just night and day. It's funny too because, you know, we have the time differences. So, you know, at the time, you know, one of my previous jobs, I was still being stubborn, just being a night owl. So there'd be times where I would like email him at like 4 a.m. and he would just blatantly say to me, it's like, hey, that's great. Go to bed. So it's like, because I know it's 4 o'clock in the morning over there. Go to bed. It's like, that's fair. I just didn't want to leave you hanging on this thing. A little more difficult for me to do that nowadays. But no, last year that was a recurring thing. I just felt like I need to get things done and just like send all the things. But no, James has been wonderful. Once again, I cannot overstate the work that he put into this. And like I said, I'm flattered that people come to me, but I am just a small percentile of the team that made this set what it is. Like I can't thank everybody enough for what they've done, even just as a fan. Like, you know, I've grown up with these films, literally. Like I started watching these films much younger than I should have, but you know, that's not a dig at my dad. If anything, I can't help but thank him for this. Like if I can pull this off, I think I have the tape somewhere around here. I need to digitize footage of me like right before my 4th birthday, where I'm jumping around the living room, making like punching and kicking noises, like having my t-shirt hang halfway off like it's the final fight of the Big Boss. And so this is like 1989, and I'm jumping around doing this. And what's really funny, going back to Vinegar Syndrome and Undefeatable, if you watch the Chinese version, Bloody Mary Killer, like I said, this was filmed not far from me. There's a scene where Robin Shu, who played Liu Kang in Mortal Kombat, you know, a movie based on one of my favorite video games, is literally walking past the shop where my dad bought my first copy of The Big Boss. So talk about worlds colliding. I'm going to try to screen cap that when I get the chance. But it's like, yeah, that was Flying Dragon weapon supply that just happened to sell martial arts movies too. And they sold a big box copy from Master Arts Video. And of course had a picture of him from Enter the Dragon, because why would you want to have a picture of him for the Big Boss? And of course, even though it said Fists of Fury on the cover, what was so cool was that this was one of the few American releases that blatantly said on the box, also known as the Big Boss.
Okay.
So even then, like some companies were still trying to go like, hey, Fists of Fury, plural, is, you know, the US title, but the Big Boss is the original title. But yeah, so worlds have definitely been colliding lately, and it's pretty amusing. So
That's wild. I really cannot wait to get my hands on it. I think Arrow over the last couple of years have been steadily impressing me more and more and more.
Oh yeah,
and particularly with the Shawscope sets.
yes.
Shaw Brothers in general, kind of my thing. I think I probably have a slightly similar connection to Lau Kar-Long that you do with the Big Boss. So, I just found his movies at the right sort of age, and I enjoyed a lot what 88 Films had done over their first. He certainly brought out some amazing movies, but there's not really. I think there's still a pretty far quality bump up to kind of where Arrow took things, with kind of going back to the original negatives again and kind of doing restorations in a way that I think 88 just didn't have the budget for. And I think it's a lot of
and that's usually the thing where it's like some companies want to do things that are just kind of out of their wheelhouse, and they kind of just look at like what is most viable to work with. And like the funny thing is, like, all these companies that have put out Shaw Brothers titles on DVD, Blu-ray, what have you, over the last like 20 years at this point, I think Arrow was pretty much the first one to go, do we have access to the actual film elements for any of these movies? And so I remember when I first heard with the first Shawscope set that they were actually going back to some of the film elements, especially for like King Boxer and my personal favorite, Boxer from Shantung. I was very happy, because I actually had, the first time I ever saw Boxer from Shantung was actually a VHS bootleg of the Dutch VHS.
Okay.
So that was technically uncut. No frame cuts or anything. So when I saw the restored version, there were moments that I could tell were cut. Like during the finale, there's one shot where there was like a freeze frame when a character falls over a balcony, and then it starts back up, and then the character lands. If you see the previous restored version from Celestial, that's missing. It just goes from the slow-mo shot of the character starting to go over the balcony to the character landing on the ground. And when Arrow did their new restoration, that was restored, including the additional like 4+ minutes. And it's funny because if you go to moviecensorship.com, they actually have done a deep dive on any of the newer restorations, showing like what exactly was missing from the previous restorations for Boxer from Shantung, for King Boxer, and pretty much all the ones Arrow has gone back to. But yeah, I will say that 88 Films kind of did the best they could with what they had to work with and the budget they had at the time. Like Marshall Club was an interesting example, because that one we ended up getting access to a scan of a US print, for mainly to try to grab for a new version of the English track, because that was the other thing too with the audio tracks. Arrow did their best to get whatever audio elements they could that weren't remastered, because for some reason the Celestial remastered audio tracks for almost all the films were just like noise reduced within an inch of their life. Like, I swear, like hearing footsteps is almost like just dropping a pin on a table. Like you hear like these like creaky sounds. Like sometimes it sound like water dripping rather than a footstep. It's like, this sounds weird. This sounds really weird. And for the longest time, it was a case of like, take it or leave it. This is the best you're going to get. But then Arrow was like, let's see what we can do. And yeah, the audio sounds much more crisp. It sounds much more filmic. And so that's the other thing too. So it's not even just the visuals, but the audio is much better as well. But yeah, like Arrow has been, like you said, knocking it out of the park, and like in all aspects, not even just the Hong Kong titles. It's like there are some cases where it's like, oh yeah, no, we have the elements we need already, so we can just use this master, use this audio, get some new extras here and there, we're good to go. And then there are other times where it's like, no, we can do better. Let's do better. And like the Bruce Lee set, like some of the titles in the Shawscope sets. So no, it's just been even, once again, when I work on these titles, I'm also a fan at the end of the day too. So there's titles that I'm not working on that I find out about later on. It's like, oh, this is really cool. Like Arrow's Street Fighter trilogy. Like I didn't work on that. And I asked James, like, hey, can I get a copy of that? Because, I like the Street Fighter trilogy, and I have the Shout set, but I saw that once again, Arrow was able to go back to film elements themselves, and they actually had new restorations done for the first two films. And even with Last Revenge, they got access to a proper HD master from, I think it was, I mixed the names up. It might be Toei, I believe, because there's Toa, Toho, and Toei. Yeah. But I can't remember who actually had the rights to the Street Fighter off the top of my head. Because the problem with the Shout set was they were working with Warner Brothers, because Warner still had the rights to the US versions. So all the masters they got were from the American releases. And so Street Fighter's Last Revenge was a sort of a cobble hodgepodge of using the US version of Street Fighter's Last Revenge and then trying to up-res DVD footage from the Japanese only scenes.
And slot them in, yeah.
It was a little rough. This also before like AI upresing for SD footage really came along. It's still being worked on, but this was basically just like blow up and sharpen and hope for the best. Because the other thing is, I believe the scenes are also out of order in the American version versus the Japanese version, which was another hurdle. But yeah, so Arrow definitely had access to better elements in every aspect for all three films. So I'm very excited to finally see those firsthand. Once again, didn't even work on that set. I just want to see it as a fan. So
that's incredible. And the two Executioner films they put out, Stigma, Silent Achievement, they're both absolutely incredible.
That too.
Really look and sound incredible, yeah. Which brings me to, I think we're slightly over now, but let's just chance our arm and see if it doesn't kick us off. And let me ask you if there's anything that you, maybe not stuff that's already come out, but if there's anything that has not seen the light of day that you would love to work on that would be a potential dream project.
So it's funny, we kind of talked a little bit about one earlier with Hong Kong Godfather, just to see come out at all. But it's funny too, because when I worked on the Joseph Kuo set, there were a lot of rumblings of what elements exist for some of his other films. Because the funny thing is,
the chess boxing.
Yeah, exactly. So some of those titles, what's funny is that a lot of people don't realize, despite me pulling my hair out and bending over backwards to reconstruct the original version of 18 Bronze Men, I actually never saw it prior to working on that set.
Okay.
I actually had, funny enough, years ago through trades, I actually had 2 DVDs of 18 Bronze Men. I had the Maya DVD, and I had the UK DVD. And all this time, I had no idea that Joseph Kuo basically went full George Lucas on this movie and re-edited the bejesus out of it using footage from some of his own other films. It was the weirdest thing. Once again, it was like he Godfrey Hoed himself. It was the best way I could put it. And so when I was sent the masters to work on some of these, because, I was doing a lot of audio work for these titles, I was just kind of like dumbfounded. I'm like, what the hell's going on with this? So, I did my OCD, ADHD thing and was like researching as much as I can on 18 Bronze Men, like why this is the way it is. And then that's why I found out it's like, oh yeah, he was using footage from 8 Masters and, all these other films, and he cut these scenes out and then he put these scenes in. And of course, one of the bigger issues was the fact that so much of the missing footage, we only had access to like a 4:3 version. So like the quality just jumps back and forth the whole time, but it was sort of a case of like, do the best you can with what you got. And the thing is, like, I don't even know if the proper film elements exist for that kind of film anymore. I wouldn't mind seeing Arrow tackle a US version of 18 Bronze Men, but we'll see. That might be too niche for the US audiences. But yeah, I'm trying to think of some other ones that I haven't worked on. I will say, I'm always the first to kind of complain about this or shut down anyone's hopes and dreams because I'm just that horrible of a person. So many of the Warner Brothers owned Golden Harvest titles I would love to work on, but like the biggest issue right now is I feel like the holy grail ones at the moment are Rumble in the Bronx, First Strike, and to an extent Thunderbolt. Then again, they're all also.
I put Pedicab Driver in that list as well.
Yeah, I was about to say, for Sammo Hung, you have Pedicab Driver, you have Encounters of the Spooky Kind 2. So those definitely leap to mind. Because the funny thing with Pedicab Driver, I actually got the DVD that they put out. But what sucks is that I know they're sitting on at least an HD master, because I think, what year was it? It was like 2014, 2015. I think Warner Brothers experimented with like a Warner Archive streaming thing. It didn't even have an app anywhere. You can only go on like a desktop computer to watch this stuff. And I think they had like a 720p Pedicab Driver. So like, it didn't look bad. Like, it was a little better than the DVD, but not by much. So I think they're sitting on at least an HD version. But no, that's the thing. Like, if you look online, there's just like a laundry list of titles that they own and that they just do next to nothing with. Like, the only titles I can even think of that they've done directly are Drunken Master 2, which, to be perfectly honest, I know I'm looking a gift horse in the puss, but it could have been better because, first of all, that master was a little DNR'd. I actually got to see this version in theaters last year, but whoever prepped that master for theatrical DCP used the wrong subtitles. They used the dub titles from the export dub. The moment I realized that for 100% certainty was during the first drunken boxing fight, and he's supposed to be saying the names of the 8 drunk gods, but he's just saying like random dub shit. He's not announcing his moves or anything. It's like, yeah, no, I'm pretty sure these are dub titles. So I came back home that night, check the Blu-ray and then I listened to the export dub. It's like, I was right that they were dub titles. Mr. Nice Guy was probably their better one just because it had I think it was a proper 4K restoration, even though it was only on Blu-ray.
They put both cuts on as well.
That too, yeah. They allowed both cuts. And I've said this for years, look, well, it's easy for us to shit on, the export versions of films, the American theatrical releases of films. If it's an option, I don't care. I like having all the options. Yeah. But if you're forcing that version on me, then I'm gonna have a problem. So with Mr. Nice Guy, I don't mind that both are on there. I think it's pretty cool because that shorter version is what I saw in theaters. So there's a little bit of nostalgia there too. But I think original Hong Kong cuts should be the priority. Yeah, the tricky thing with Drunken Master 2, and the obvious reason why they wouldn't put the US version on there is because they don't own it. With Mr. Nice Guy, they own both cuts, but Drunken Master 2, that would have been a Miramax Dimension Films thing to have the Legend of Drunken Master as an alternate version, or even the audio track. And that was the weirdest thing about Super Cop, because both the Eureka and 88 Films releases managed to get the US cut on there. And when I was helping Shout Factory with Iron Monkey, I really didn't do much on that one. I was kind of just supervising and just like, hey, make sure you have this, this, and this. And then I digitized my old TV spots from 20 years ago and gave them to them. But the one thing I asked about, and one thing they want to do, was they also want to do like Super Cop and see if they can get the US cut on there as a bonus. And I even said, oh, hey, I'll even reconstruct it using the new 2K restoration. And I even started doing that just preemptively. And then eventually they're like, yeah, no, Paramount's not letting us do that. I'm like, Which is so strange because, Super Cop didn't seem to be an issue. So I don't know why that one was an issue. Yeah.
I would have thought Super Cop so much more high profile in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, Iron Monkey's an amazing film, but I think an awful lot less and a slightly smaller audience in some ways. Like Jackie Chan's releases always kind of still sell much, much more. I think the other one on the subject of Warner's, because they're sitting on Choi Hark's The Blade as well, which is the other one that I think they did a DVD as part of their archive version.
I think Blade of Fury was another one as well.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, like I said, there's so much just in that catalog alone that would, keep a lot of Blu-ray teams busy for years. But the other thing, and I'll be blunt, is that Mike Leader and I we talk about this online, is that we would love to help Warner Brothers with these, but they don't really do anything externally. Like even Criterion was like, hey, can you help with these things? Oh yeah, sure. But Warner Brothers, like, no, we'll just do it internally. And like I said, Mr. Nice Guy was okay. You had both cuts. You had multiple trailers. A commentary would have been nice. And some people weren't too fond of how the audio sounded. And there were better options out there. But considering what we could have gotten, it could have been worse. But that being said, someone recently posted online a picture from the BBFC for Rumble in the Bronx for its UK release.
Short version.
Again, and it would have been one thing if both showed up. It's like, oh, they're going to put both cuts on there. That makes sense. But no, only
I'm still holding out hope. I really am.
No, maybe.
Sometimes the BBFC is not that quick. I mean, I'm the BBFC, arguably one of my least favorite organizations in the world. Not just for that, they seem to constantly have to try and justify their own existence in a way that's so that they're marking of every conceivable surface on a release with one of their little tags. Does my head in. At least we're getting removable stickers now, thankfully, on some releases. But Jesus, it's kind of all the people buying physical media, and that's going to bring me to a question that I've been asking everyone I've been sitting down with. I've been very lucky to sit down with Mike, and I've been able to kind of sit down with Frank Jeng and sat down with Adam from Third Window, who has a very different perspective, a kind of much more based on units that are shifting, because that's where his bottom line is. But do you think we're currently in a golden age for physical media, or are we in a twilight era?
The thing is, I was thinking about this the other day, and it's very fluid, for lack of a better term, because when you see what's going on with streaming, it's very hit or miss. It's very back and forth. I mean, I will say it does feel like a golden era, because we are getting, not only are we getting good restorations of titles, including some titles that I would never have expected, Undefeatable, for example, let alone in 4K, we're actually getting like good extras as well. Like we're getting these, companies sending people out to, interview, cast, crew, get them for commentaries, all these titles that, barely would have been a blip otherwise. So, and once again, you see all this infighting with streaming, and it's getting to the point now where I'm seeing movies and shows made for these streaming services being pulled from these streaming services. So where it's like, how are we going to watch these now? You know, with physical media, you really didn't have that issue. Like back in the day, even with like TV shows that were made for network television, they were putting them out on DVD. Like almost every TV show had a DVD in, you know, the early aughts, as they would say. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's sort of a give and take. I think one of the other examples is I think it was Bob Iger at Disney, because he returned to Disney, and he said something along the lines of, hey, we should start diving into our catalog for more physical releases and not just, you know, the brand new stuff or, you know, the Disney Vault or anything like that. Like we should be, you know, taking advantage of this. So, you know, we'll see where that goes. And then you have some companies like Paramount doing some pretty good work with their 4K release. They have their Paramount Presents line. It's been a little hit or miss. Some of the 4Ks leave more to be desired, while some are pretty good. Warner Brothers, I know it's just talking about the whole Golden Harvest thing. They've been trying to dive more into their catalog now. I think especially this year with their whole 100th anniversary, which didn't surprise me. I was kind of expecting that going into this year, because I remember back in 98 with their 75th anniversary, which of course timed with the 25th anniversary of Enter the Dragon at the time, just like this year, 100th anniversary of Warner Brothers with the 50th of Enter the Dragon.
Yeah.
But you know, it's been a little hit or miss. Like they had their incomplete Rocky set, which had 4 movies, 2 cuts with for Rocky 4 at least, and I heard very mixed things in the reviews. Like apparently the video quality was good, but apparently there were a lot of audio issues. So I'm hoping when they do the inevitable 6 film set, which I'll wait for that rather than get the 4 film set, hopefully any of those issues will be resolved, but we'll see, because I also read a few mixed things about the Superman set as well. So Warner Brothers is trying, but they still got a little more room to work on.
Funny one that there's been a really weird, like I'm a big fan of Mantelab, based out of Hong Kong, and Mantelab have almost at this point almost become an official Warner Brothers partner, where almost every release that they're putting out is a Warner Brothers movie, but in much nicer packaging, usually the same discs, but they do a really good job of kind of like pimping out or pimp my riding Warner Brothers releases from a printed media or the printed extras point of view, and kind of nice covers and things. But I find it really interesting that those are the titles that are sort of selling the best in Hong Kong, weirdly. I guess maybe the grass is always greener, you know. We're in the West struggling for Hong Kong movies, and in Hong Kong they're struggling for another copy of The Batman or another copy of Inception.
Hey, you never know. But yeah, that's the thing. Like you were talking about struggling for that in the West. Like I feel like the UK is where it's like blown up the most, because I'm looking at my shelves over here, and like so many of them
Region B
copies. Yeah, like it's probably, I'm seeing probably more Region B than Region A, or at least, you know, AB. But you know, in the US, like, you know, we're slowly getting more stuff over here now between, you know, 88 and Arrow and Shout. But it's still like very much a slow but sure scenario, because a lot of these are titles that, you know, we're catching up on like 4 or 5 years after the fact. So, and it's always interesting to see like what sells here. Like, you know, the Jackie Chan titles still do pretty well. Bruce Lee obviously has been big for years. Like I've lost count of how many times I've seen those films re-released from various companies, because for the longest time, pretty much, I want to say from like the beginning of like VHS through like just before Shout did their release, CBS Fox, basically 20th Century Fox, had the rights to the Bruce Lee films for VHS, DVD. And it was just funny watching them like change over the years. Laserdisc as well. I think they even did CED, for those who remember that format. You know, sort of like, let's take Laserdisc but make it even worse. Not a dig at Laserdisc per se, but it's like you're trying to print a movie onto a record. It seemed like that's what CED basically was, and they didn't do a lot. I think only Game of Death was put out on CED from CBS Fox, and then Enter the Dragon was put out by Warner Brothers. But yeah, Fox just had like a death grip on them for years. In fact, they did the I think it was the Bruce Lee Ultimate Collection, which was basically just a repackaging of the Hong Kong IVL set from 2004, I believe, except they got rid of Enter the Dragon for obvious reasons. They took out Game of Death 2 because they gave that its own release later on. And so yeah, like here in the US, it's basically just stick with what you know with a lot of the companies. So it's been a little refreshing that we've been seeing more companies trying new things. Like I didn't expect Shout to do the Tiger Cage trilogy, but I think, you know, having Donnie Yen in there didn't hurt, especially with John Wick 4, and, you know, a few years back with Rogue One. So obviously there's some familiarity there that they're playing off of. But yeah, no, going back to the initial question, I don't think it's the Twilight per se. it's always interesting looking at sales numbers. There's one channel I'll watch once in a while, Films at Home, and he talks about sales numbers. And it's so funny looking at the pie chart because you see that DVD still dominates.
Yeah.
Because, it is the cheapest format. It's still, a decent quality product. Blu-rays in second, and 4K is dead last.
Tiny little sliver.
Exactly, yeah. And the thing is, like, it's so bizarre to me because I feel like each of the other formats kind of future-proof, because my first 4K was actually Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and I didn't even have a 4K player yet. But I knew that the new restoration was on the Blu-ray that it came with, so it was future-proof. So it's like, well, I don't have a 4K player now, but if I feel so inclined, I can watch the new restoration on the Blu-ray that it comes with. And that's kind of what happened with Blu-ray as well, because Blu-ray, when that first became a thing, like, hey, it comes with a DVD. It's like, oh, so if you don't have Blu-ray yet, you can watch DVD for now, and then when you upgrade to Blu-ray, you're good to go. But then again, you now have like the PS5, which has 4K playback. I don't know if the Xbox Series was a Series X. I think that's the one with the actual disk drive. I don't know if that has 4K as well, but it might. At least for gameplay, obviously it does, but I don't know if it plays 4K movie discs. But no, the PS5 definitely does. So I think that might give a little more of a boost. But then again, we assume that with Blu-ray, and it did, but it not the same, giant, big bang as DVD did with the PS2. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's still doing well enough. I think it's just because a lot of it's moved online that you can't just stroll into like a Best Buy or something here in the US. Like, you can still find Blu-rays at a Best Buy here, but compared to the way it used to be with like shelves upon shelves upon shelves, no. Like, you get like the brand new stuff and like a few other things. Like, I'm shocked when I still see like a Scream Factory, Criterion, or Arrow title at a Best Buy. Like, once a blue moon, they'll pop up. Like, I saw the RoboCop 4K from Arrow at Best Buy like a week ago. I'm like, oh, that's a surprise. Cool. So yeah, I think it's just a mix of things. I think the companies are just learning how to target the markets better rather than just throwing like tens of thousands of copies out and then they don't sell enough. But then if you put out like 3,000 to 6,000 copies, the fans who really want them, they'll snag them. If it does well enough, then they'll do like a cheaper release down the road or something like that, like a standard release that doesn't come with any like the physical extras or things like that. So I think they've just found a better way to market these titles. So yeah, like, part of it seems like, oh no, physical media is dying because you can't find it in stores. You just go online now. Like, I love the brick and mortar aspect. I love strolling into a store or buying something and leaving. But there are times where, at the end of the day, it's just more convenient or more accessible online to grab these titles. So I think it's just a matter of, physical media adapting to changing times. And that's the thing. I think it's just because while streaming has taken off and while a lot of these things have gone out of brick and mortar stores, I don't think we're at them dying yet, especially with how well a lot of titles still sell. So, but that's just me. So
no, I would agree, and I think the way the kind of the sort of the evolution of the boutique label has been a really wonderful thing to see, because I think, like you say, smaller organizations, they can move much faster, they can respond more directly and interact much more easily with their fan base and with their core audience. So they're more easy to adapt to change quicker. So I think it's a good thing, and I think if it ends up being enough, the few thousand of us worldwide that are continuing to buy the releases is enough to sustain things, then long may it reign. I don't think we're going to be replacing our Blu-rays and our 4Ks with 8Ks at any stage, but I certainly hope we get another good 5 or 10 years out of the Blu-ray and the 4K format, which I think there's no reason why we shouldn't.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But I must let you go and get on with your Sunday, because I'm very aware that you've given me a huge amount of time, which I'm very, very grateful for.
No big deal.
It's been really, really good fun, enlightening, and very good fun. So thank you so much.
Indeed, it was a pleasure.
It's been wonderful, and I think we shall encourage everybody. I will leave links down below to Arrow, to all the usual suspects, for people to track down both the Bruce Lee box set, and if you're in the States, fear not, jump all over New Fist of Fury. That looks incredible. And anything else that you want to let people know to get or to keep an eye out for? We mentioned Vinegar Syndrome and Undefeatable. Yes. By the time this video goes up, that's going to be out there. So jump all over that.
Yes, too. You might not. Well, yeah. Depending on when this video comes out, it should be available to order again. Like I said earlier, they're doing the partners only thing at the time we're recording this, so it should still be back later on at the very least. But it'll be out and about in the world by the time it comes up. But yeah, for things that have already been announced, I'm trying to think of anything else, but. Not off the top of my head, but all I'll say is at the time of recording, expect at least another U.S. release to be announced from Arrow soon. There's a couple more that I've been working on behind the scenes. One for September, one for October. That should be getting announced soon. So the September one should be getting announced at the end of the month. That's all I'm going to say. I was going to give a clue. It's like, no, it's going to be too on the nose.
Nah, don't do it. Don't do it. I would love for you to let's just pop a pin in it, and I'll try and entice you back come autumn, winter time, and we can do a part 2 of this and kind of look at where we're at as we head towards Christmas time. Because I'm sure there's going to be a bunch of new releases kind of inbound for that time of year too.
Sounds about right.
Amazing. Thank you so much. In which case, then it is goodbye from me, and it is goodbye from Brandon.
Sounds good. Have a
good
one.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Take care.